Imagine standing before the gates of the greatest city on earth at dusk 27 centuries ago. Picture it. You have been walking for days across the plains of northern Mesopotamia, and the city has been visible since morning. A line of walls on the horizon that refused, hour after hour, to stop growing. Now, at last, in the failing golden light, you stand beneath them. Ramparts of brick and stone rising 100 feet above the plain, wide enough on top for chariots to pass 3 abreast, running away to either side farther than you can see. 12 kilometers of circuit, 15 great gates, and behind them a city of more than 100,000 souls. Nineveh on the Tigris, capital of the Assyrian Empire, mistress of the world from the Nile to the mountains of Persia. Above you, flanking the gate itself, stand the guardians. And it is the guardians you will remember all your life. Colossal winged bulls carved from single blocks of gleaming alabaster, 5 meters tall, 40 tons apiece. The body of a bull for strength, the wings of an eagle for swiftness, and the head of a man, serene and terrible under a horned crown, with the faint smile of something that has watched 1,000 years of travellers pass under its gaze and been surprised by none of them. The Assyrians called them lamassu, protective spirits, set at every gate and doorway of power to hold the line between order and chaos. Carved into the slabs at their feet, in the dense wedge-shaped script of the empire, run the words of the king. And though you cannot read them, you can feel what they say, because everything around you says it. The torchlight beginning to flare along the walls, the smell of cedar smoke and horses, the traffic of the whole earth funneling through the gate. Phoenician merchants and Egyptian envoys, Median horse dealers, Judean masons, Elamite captives, Arab camelmen, all of them moving under the stone smile of the winged bulls into the city that rules them all. This is the center of the world. There has never been anything like it before. Not this large, not this organized, not this feared, anywhere in all the history of the human race. And that is the precise, sober, astonishing claim of tonight's journey. The Assyrian Empire was the first superpower in history, the first state ever to unite the entire civilized world of its region under one power, the first with a professional standing army, an imperial road system flowing with the first courier post, an intelligence service, a provincial bureaucracy. The whole grim, brilliant machinery of empire invented here from nothing and inherited, piece by piece, by every empire that ever came after. Babylon copied Assyria, Persia copied Babylon copying Assyria, Alexander took Persia's copy, Rome studied Alexander's, and so on down the whole long corridor of history. Every empire humanity has built since stands, knowingly or not, on foundations quarried at Nineveh. And yet, here is the strangeness we will live inside all night. This same empire, so mighty that its fall seemed to its subjects like the breaking of the sky, was erased more suddenly and completely than any great power in history. Within a single generation of its height, Nineveh was a ruin. Within 2 centuries, Greek soldiers marched past these very walls and did not know their name. The first superpower became the first cautionary tale. Remembered for 2,500 years only in the hostile verses of its enemies, until, barely more than a century and a half ago, men with shovels opened the great mounds by the Tigris and found, waiting in the dark, the winged bulls, the carved histories, and, most miraculous of all, a library. 30,000 tablets of clay, the collected knowledge of Mesopotamia, buried in the fire that killed the empire and preserved by the very flames that destroyed it. Tonight, we will walk the whole of that story, from beginning to end and beyond the end. We will start small, astonishingly small, with a modest city of merchants on a bend of the Tigris, whose traders led donkey caravans into the mountains of Anatolia and wrote home letters that still survive, complaining about taxes and asking about the children. We will watch that city learn war in the hardest school on earth, survive the collapse of the entire Bronze Age world, and then, in the Age of Iron, build itself into something new under the sun. The machine, the army that never disbanded, the roads that never ended, the kings who counted their conquests like harvests. We will meet those kings in all their doubled nature. Ashurnasirpal, who threw a banquet for 70,000 guests and carved his cruelties into stone beside the menu. Sennacherib, who built Nineveh into the wonder of the world and watered it with aqueducts of a scale not seen again for centuries. Esarhaddon, the anxious conqueror of Egypt, who hid from omens on the advice of his astrologers while ruling everything from the Nile to the Caspian. And Ashurbanipal, the scholar king, who boasted not only of his archery but of his handwriting, and gathered into his palace the library that would carry Gilgamesh itself across the abyss of time to us. We will tour the machine at work. The provinces and the post riders, the engineers and the deportation caravans, the terror that was policy and the order that was real, keeping both ledgers honestly, as this fire always does. And then we will watch the unthinkable, the swift, total, still debated fall. Nineveh broken in a single season by its former subjects, the first superpower gone so utterly that its very language of power survived only underground, in the dark, on tablets of baked clay, waiting. It is one of the mightiest stories of the ancient world, and one of its greatest warnings. And it ends, as we shall see, not in ashes at all, but in a museum gallery in the lamplight, and in living villages where the descendants of Assyria still speak, to this day, a daughter of the empire's tongue. Before we pass under the winged bulls, a quiet word. If these long journeys into the deep past bring you something, some calm, some wonder, some company in the late hours, you might take a moment to leave a like and to follow along with the channel, but only if these journeys are truly yours. It is a small thing, and it helps other travelers in the night find their way to this fire. And if you feel like it, leave a word below to say where you are listening from tonight, your city and the hour it is where you are. There is a quiet pleasure in knowing that someone far away, in another corner of the old empire of the world, is passing through the same great gate tonight. But there is nothing you must do. The only thing that matters now is the torchlight on the alabaster, and the stone smile of the guardians, and the story that is about to begin. So stand a last moment before the gate as the dusk deepens, and the first stars come out over the Tigris, and the watchmen call the hour along the walls in the language of 100 nations. In a moment we will go in. But stories, like rivers, are best entered at their source, and the source of this one lies far upstream of all this glory. 14 centuries upstream, at a small, sun-baked, sacred town on a rock above the river, whose name the empire would carry to the ends of the earth. The city of Ashur, where a god and a people shared one name, and where the whole colossal story began with something no one ever expects of the Assyrians. Not a sword, a contract. Before the story begins, let us pause, as we always do at this fire, on the question beneath it. How do we know? For Assyria, the answer is a story in its own right, and one of the strangest in all of historical knowledge. Because for nearly 2,500 years, humanity remembered the Assyrian Empire only through the words of its enemies and victims. The Hebrew Bible remembered it vividly and bitterly. Assyria is Scripture's very archetype of imperial arrogance. The rod of God's anger, the destroyer of Israel, the great city Nineveh whose wickedness rose to heaven. The prophet Nahum's exultation over its fall is one of the fiercest poems of triumph ever written, and Jonah's reluctant mission to Nineveh kept the city's name alive in 3 world religions. The Greeks remembered a blurred legend, a distant, decadent empire of fabulous kings and the warrior queen Semiramis, half history and half fairy tale. And that was all. Assyria's own voice. The hundreds of thousands of documents a bureaucratic superpower generates, was utterly lost, the script unreadable, the language dead, the cities themselves dissolved into great grassy mounds by the Tigris on which villages grazed their sheep. When the Greek general Xenophon marched 10,000 mercenaries past the ruins of Nineveh in 401 BC, barely 2 centuries after its fall, he recorded the enormous deserted walls with wonder and called the place by a garbled name, having no idea he was walking past the capital of the world. Few empires have ever fallen so far out of memory while remaining, in another sense, so famous. Everyone knew the name Nineveh. No one on earth knew where it was or what it had truly been. The recovery, when it came, was one of the great adventures of the 19th century. A story of consuls and rivalries, river rafts loaded with winged bulls, and a decipherment race as dramatic as any battle in our tale. In the 1840s, digging into the mounds opposite Mosul and downstream at Nimrud, the Frenchman Paul-Émile Botta and the Englishman Austen Henry Layard, a restless young adventurer who had fallen in love with the mounds on his way to a law career in Ceylon and simply never continued the journey, broke through into buried palaces, room after room of carved alabaster slabs, kings and sieges and lion hunts in stone, colossal lamassu rising out of the earth with their ancient smiles intact. The finds ignited Europe. Winged bulls were floated down the Tigris on rafts of inflated goatskins, shipped around the Cape, and hauled into the British Museum and the Louvre, where they stand today. Layard's book became a bestseller, and Nineveh, biblical, wicked, magnificent Nineveh, was suddenly spectacularly real. But slabs are pictures. The voice came from the tablets. In the ruins of Nineveh's palaces, Layard and his brilliant Iraqi-born successor, Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyrian Christian of Mosul, a native son excavating his own ancestral capital, whose contributions Victorian society long undercredited, uncovered the find of finds. The royal library of King Ashurbanipal, tens of thousands of clay tablets and fragments, the systematically collected knowledge of all Mesopotamia. Epics and prayers, star charts and medical texts, dictionaries, omen books, letters of state, baked hard and thereby preserved by the very fire that destroyed the palace above them. The empire's death had accidentally archived its mind. And meanwhile, in one of scholarship's finest hours, the script itself was being broken. The key was a cliff at Behistun in Persia, where Darius the Great had carved one proclamation in 3 languages, and a British officer named Henry Rawlinson dangled on ladders and ropes above the void to copy it. The Rosetta Stone of cuneiform, won by mountaineering. By 1857, the decipherment was proven in famous style. The Royal Asiatic Society sent one unpublished Assyrian inscription to 4 scholars separately, sealed their translations, and opened them together. They matched. Assyria could speak again. And speak it did, in a flood no one anticipated. Within a generation, a self-taught museum assistant named George Smith, sorting Nineveh fragments in London, found himself reading a Babylonian story of a great flood, a ship, a raven and a dove. The epic of Gilgamesh, 1,000 years older than the Bible's version. And, by the famous account, was so overcome that he leapt up and began to undress before the astonished museum staff. The library has never stopped talking since. Tonight's story is built from all of it. The reliefs and the ruins, the royal annals with their boasts and their horrors, the treaties and tax rolls, the scholars' letters to anxious kings, the enemy's scriptures read now alongside the empire's own files, cross-examined by 2 centuries of archaeology from Nimrod's golden tombs to the latest drone surveys of ancient canals. Few ancient states can be known so intimately, from so many angles at once. Assyria, the monster of the prophets; Assyria, the machine of the archives; Assyria, the patron of the library. All real, all one. Our task tonight, as ever, is to hold them together honestly. And it begins where Assyria itself began, on a rock above the Tigris, in the city of the god. Everything begins at Ashur. And Ashur, delightfully, is 3 things wearing one name: a city, a god, and eventually a people. And the braid of the 3 is the deepest thread in the whole 14th century story. The city first, a natural fortress on a bluff above the west bank of the Tigris, in the north of Mesopotamia, commanding a river crossing and the seam between 2 worlds. To the south, the ancient irrigated flatlands of Sumer and Babylon, old in cities before Ashur was anything. To the north and east, the rain-fed plains and rolling foothills, where the Tigris comes down out of the mountains of Anatolia and the Zagros. That seam is Assyria's fate written in geography. Unlike Babylonia, which lives or dies by canals, the Assyrian heartland, the triangle of country around Ashur, Nineveh, and Arbela, receives just enough winter rain in most years to grow wheat and barley without irrigation. A farming base sturdier and simpler than the South's, supporting a hardy population of villagers who ploughed with oxen, raised sheep in the millions on the steppe margins, and could be levied when the day came into the toughest infantry of the age. But the rain is marginal. A few dry years in a row mean hunger, and the land is open. No deserts or seas protect it. The mountain tribes look down on it from three sides. Every conqueror's road runs through it. Assyria's geography offered its people a blunt, permanent choice, and all of Assyrian history is the working out of it. Be the crossroads everyone crosses, or own the roads. They would try both in that order. Now the god, Ashur, the divine Ashur, began, most scholars judge, as the numinous spirit of the rock itself. The crag was the god was the place, and the city on it was simply his household. He had, at the start, none of the usual divine biography. No famous parents, no adventures, no mythology to speak of. He was simply Ashur, the presence of the place, worshipped in one temple on one rock by one modest community. And this local, almost private god would undergo the strangest career in ancient religion. As his city's power grew, Ashur grew with it, absorbing the attributes of greater gods, taking over the Babylonian creation epic with his own name pasted over the heroes, until the god of the rock had become lord of the universe, the divine emperor whose earthly estate was, in principle, everything. Here is the crucial point, worth holding all night, because it is the ideological engine of the entire empire. The Assyrian king was not himself a god. Unlike Pharaoh, he was emphatically mortal, and the texts are careful about it. He was something in practice more formidable, the god's steward, the human manager of Ashur's estate, whose standing orders were, in effect, to enlarge it. Every campaign was framed as the god's business. Every land not yet obedient was, by definition, in rebellion against an order the god had already decreed. The king reported his wars to Ashur in formal letters, like an estate agent writing to the landlord. It is empire as theology. Expansion not as ambition, but as duty. Conquest as a kind of cosmic tidying up. And whether any given king believed it or merely wielded it, the framework never changed in 1,000 years. A city that is a god whose estate is the world, a king who is the estate's manager. Load that engine onto the geography of the open crossroads, and the shape of everything to come is already visible in outline, like a relief before the final carving. But, and this is the joy of beginnings, the first Assyria to step into the light of history is not a war machine at all. In its earliest well-documented age, the city of Ashur held no empire, commanded no legions, and frightened no one. It was a town of perhaps a few thousand families, self-governing to a remarkable degree. The king in this period is called merely the steward, and real power sat with a city assembly and the eponym officials who gave each year its name. And its citizens were busy with something else entirely, business. For the first great Assyrian export was not terror, it was tin. And thereby hangs one of the most wonderful and least known chapters in all of ancient history. The tale of the donkey caravans, the merchant colonies of Anatolia, and the family firms of Ashur, whose private letters, by a miracle of clay and fire, we can still read today by the tens of thousands. Around 1900 BC, 13 centuries before Nineveh's glory, the city of Ashur sat at the junction of two indispensable flows. From the east, down the Zagros roads from distant sources in Central Asia, came tin, the strategic metal of the age, the essential 1/9 of bronze, without which no tool or weapon of the era could be cast, and which Anatolia, rich in everything else, conspicuously lacked. Within Mesopotamia itself moved the other commodity, fine woven textiles, the famous woolens of the south and of Ashur's own workshops. And northwest, beyond the Taurus Mountains, lay Anatolia, a patchwork of prosperous native kingdoms sitting on some of the richest silver and gold country of the ancient world, hungry for tin and cloth and able to pay in precious metal. The merchants of Ashur put the three facts together and built upon them the best documented commercial system of the entire ancient world. For 2 centuries, generation after generation, their donkey caravans. each animal loaded with about 65 kilos of tin under official seal, or 30 fine textiles, plodded the 1,200-kilometer road from the Tigris up through the passes into the heart of Anatolia, 6 weeks each way, to a network of Assyrian trading colonies planted beside the Anatolian towns. The greatest of these stood at Kanesh, the mound of Kultepe, near modern Kayseri in central Turkey, where a whole Assyrian merchant quarter, the Karam, grew up at the foot of the native king's citadel. Streets of mud brick houses that were at once homes, offices, and warehouses, inhabited by expatriate Assyrian families doing business under their own laws, paying agreed taxes to the local palace and writing. Endlessly, obsessively writing. And when fire took the quarter, twice, the letters baked and survived. More than 22,000 tablets from the houses of Kanesh, the private archives of family firms, the oldest large business archive on Earth, and one of the most human windows ever opened on the ancient world. Listen to what is in them, because nothing else tonight will sound so startlingly familiar. Contracts and partnership agreements. Investors in Ashur pooling gold into a merchant's joint stock fund for a term of years, profits to be divided by share. Transport documents, customs declarations, and a lively literature of tax evasion. Letters coolly advising which mountain byways avoid the tolls, what to declare and what to hide in the packing. Credit instruments, loans at interest, promissory notes payable to the bearer, debt collection, default, and the occasional debtor's flight. Market intelligence flashing down the road. Silver is up at Ashurbanipal. Hold the tin. Sell the cloth now. Partnership disputes, lawsuits before the merchant colony's own court, appeals home to the city assembly of Ashur, and woven through the commerce, the families, fathers training sons in the trade, brothers accusing brothers, and above all the women of Ashur. Because the men lived years at a time in Anatolia, the wives who remained became businesswomen of substance, weaving on their own account the very textiles the caravans carried, selling to the firm, managing property, and writing to their husbands letters that crackle across 4,000 years. Complaints about money not sent, sharp inquiries about rumours of an Anatolian second wife. Many merchants indeed kept 2 households, a wife in Ashur and a wife in Kanesh, under contracts regulating the arrangement, demands that he settle his accounts with the temple, news of the children, piety, fury, and love. One woman writes to her absent husband, in essence, "You love only money, and you hate your own life." Another sends socks. This, not the winged bulls, not the flayed rebels, is the first Assyria history can hear speaking. A town of accountants and weavers, argumentative, litigious, family-minded, profit-sharp, whose empire was a network of contracts stretching 1,000 kilometers with hardly a soldier in sight, held together by trust, credit, and the enforcement of the city god's temple, in whose name oaths were sworn and ingots sealed. It is worth savouring the irony slowly, because history rarely serves it so pure. The people who would one day invent the military superpower entered the world's stage as its first great multinational business community, and the discipline, literacy, organization, and long-range logistics of the counting house would all, in time, be conscripted. The caravans themselves faded in the 18th century BC, as Anatolia's politics turned violent and new powers rose athwart the roads. The Karam of Kanesh burned its last archive and was not rebuilt. But something had been learned on that long road that Assyria never forgot. How to project organization across enormous distances. How to make a system, run by families and functionaries, do the work of presence. 4 centuries of donkeys had drawn the first faint map of empire. The next age would ink it in blood and iron, beginning with an ambitious outsider who seized the merchant city and dreamed, for the first time on the Tigris, a king-sized dream. The merchant city's quiet centuries ended, as quiet centuries do, with an ambitious man and an army. Around 1808 BC, there seized the throne of Ashur a figure the Assyrian king list itself candidly describes as an outsider, Shamshi-Adad, an Amorite war chief, one of the West Semitic newcomer dynasts then carving up Mesopotamia, who took the merchant city as one piece of a much larger board. Within a generation, he had built the first true territorial kingdom of the north, from the Euphrates bend to the Zagros foothills, with Ashur and Nineveh in his hand, the great city of Mari on the Euphrates under one son and the eastern marches under another, while he ruled the whole from a new capital in the steppe. He is a gift to historians, because Mari's palace archives survive. Thousands of letters, including his own correspondence with his sons, which show us, with painful comedy, the first Assyrian Empire as a family firm under stress. To the capable son, crisp strategic instruction. To the feckless one at Mari, a stream of paternal exasperation quoted ever since. While your brother wins victories here, you lie about among the women. Are you a child? Grow up! The authentic voice of every disappointed father in history, preserved in baked clay. Shamshi-Adad titled himself King of the Universe, the first on the Tigris to reach for the style the great Sargon of Akkad had coined, and for one lifetime he made it half plausible. But the kingdom was a personal creation, and it obeyed the iron rule of personal creations. It died with its creator. Within decades of his death, his structure was carved up by the rising powers of the age. Above all by Hammurabi of Babylon, whose own star was climbing in the south, and Ashur sank back into the second rank, a respectable city-state among wolves. The first dream of empire had lasted one generation, but it had been dreamed. The title, the scale, the method of sons as viceroys and provinces in embryo had all been tried once and remembered. Assyrian kings 1,000 years later would still name Shamshi-Adad in their lineages, the honoured ancestor of the ambition itself. There followed the long school. 4 centuries, roughly 1750 to 1360 BC, that the chronicles pass over in embarrassed brevity, and that we may compress with equal mercy, keeping only what shaped the future. Assyria spent much of this age as a modest player in other kingdoms' games, and for a painful stretch as an outright vassal. The great power of the north in these centuries was Mitanni, a formidable kingdom of the Hurrian peoples, ruled by an aristocracy of chariot lords, which at its height reduced Ashur to a tribute-paying dependency and even carried off, as plunder, the doors of the god's own temple. The humiliation was remembered in the precise way Assyria remembered everything, with interest. What the long school taught was survival's curriculum, the arts of the buffer state. Reading the balance among giants Mitanni, the Hittites in Anatolia, Kassite Babylon in the south, imperial Egypt beyond, bending without breaking, keeping the core lands and the god's city intact through every storm. The deepening of institutions. The eponym year lists ticking on unbroken, the temple and the traditions holding while dynasties wavered, and the slow banking of a national temperament, patient, tough-minded, unillusioned, convinced by 4 centuries of evidence that the world respects nothing but strength and that weakness is simply an invoice not yet delivered. When the wheel finally turned, when Mitanni was broken in the 14th century between the hammer of the resurgent Hittites and its own civil wars, Assyria was ready in a way no one else quite noticed until too late. King Ashurbanipal I stepped through the wreckage, reclaimed independence, gathered the eastern half of Mitanni's carcass, and announced the new reality to the world in the most literal way the age allowed. He wrote to the Pharaoh of Egypt. The letter survives, in the diplomatic archive found at Amarna on the Nile. Ashurbanipal addressing Egypt's monarch as brother, king to king, great power to great power, with gifts and the request for gold that all the great kings traded in. Babylon, scandalized, wrote to Egypt demanding the upstart be refused recognition. The Assyrians sniffed the Babylonian king. Are my vassals? Why are they writing to you directly? Egypt received them anyway. The club of superpowers had, however grudgingly, seated a new member, and the merchant city on the rock, after 1,000 years of history, had entered the age of the great kings. Just in time to learn how great kings behave in the last brilliant, brutal century of the Bronze Age. The Middle Assyrian kingdom that now unfolded, the 13th century BC above all, was the empire's rehearsal, performed at 3/4 scale with the full cast of later themes. The kings came hard and capable, and 2 dominate the act. Adad-nirari I and his son Shalmaneser I finished Mitanni for good, annexing its remnant lands east of the Euphrates and pioneering on their new western territories, the techniques the world would later learn to dread in their descendants' hands. Rebel populations uprooted and resettled at the crown's convenience. The deportation system in its first deliberate form, conquered land reorganized into provinces under appointed governors rather than left to client kings, garrison towns, granaries, and the beginnings of a standing administrative grid. Then came the summit and the warning in a single extraordinary reign, Tukulti-Ninurta I, the mightiest and strangest king of the age. He fought everyone and beat them all. The mountain peoples, the Hittite frontier, and at last the unthinkable, Babylon itself, the old cultural motherland, the city every northern king had been raised to revere. Tukulti-Ninurta defeated the Kassite king of Babylon, took him to Ashur in chains, and the sacrilege rang across the whole ancient world, sacked the holy city, breached its walls, and carried the statue of Marduk, Babylon's supreme god, into Assyrian exile. He celebrated in the grandest manner, an epic poem commissioned to justify the conquest as the god's own verdict. The first great work of Assyrian imperial literature, propaganda raised to art. The title King of the Universe dusted off and worn daily. And, in a gesture of pharaonic ambition, an entire new capital city built for himself across the river from Ashur and named, with sublime immodesty, Kar Tukulti-Ninurta, the Quay of Tukulti-Ninurta. It was too much, too fast, and the age itself said so. The conquest of Babylon proved unholdable, the new capital an extravagance, the king increasingly isolated in his self-named city, until the account was settled in the way that would become a dark rhyme of Assyrian history, conspiracy at the top and the king's own son among the plotters. Tukulti-Ninurta was besieged in his palace and murdered around 1207 BC. The Chronicles of Babylon recorded the sacrilege repaid with grim satisfaction, and the timing of the fall carries a chill the participants could not see. Within a decade or two of the great king's murder, the entire world he had bestrode began, everywhere at once, to collapse. For now came the catastrophe we have met before at this fire, from its other shores, the Bronze Age collapse. The sudden, cascading ruin around 1200 BC of the whole interconnected order of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire, Assyria's mighty neighbour and rival, gone, its capital burned and abandoned forever. The palace civilization of Mycenaean Greece, gone. The great port of Ugarit, the trade webs, the diplomatic brotherhood of the Amarna Age, Egypt's Asian Empire, gone or maimed past recognition. Sea raiders on the coasts, famine and drought in the records, whole peoples in motion, the lights going out around the horizon like camps abandoned before a storm. And here is the fact on which the entire second half of our story pivots. Assyria survived. Battered. The 12th and 11th centuries were hard, hungry, and narrow. Aramaean tribes flooding out of the Syrian steppe stripped away the western conquests year by year until little beyond the old heartland triangle remained. But the core never broke. The rain-fed farms needed no fragile canal bureaucracy. The compact heartland could be defended. The institutions, king, god, army, year lists, ran on without a single recorded interruption. One strong late king, Tiglath-Pileser I, even blazed out in the gathering dark, marching to the Mediterranean, hunting elephants, compiling law codes and libraries, before the shadows closed again. When the long crisis finally eased, around 950 BC, the map of the civilized world had been wiped nearly clean. Every other great power of the Bronze Age was dead, dying, or dismembered. And Assyria, the tough, angry, undefeated survivor, stood in the ruins with its institutions intact, its grievances catalogued, its army seasoned by 2 centuries of desperate defense, and its new metal. For these dark centuries were precisely the age in which iron replaced bronze, and Assyria sat beside Anatolia's ironworking, heartlands, waiting in the forges. Every empire is an answer to a question. The question the wrecked world now posed was, Who will impose order on the chaos? Assyria had spent 1400 years becoming the answer, and the age that answered. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, the first superpower, is where our story now, at last, arrives. The Neo-Assyrian Empire did not begin with a thunderclap. It began with farm ledgers, and there is something deeply characteristic in that. Around 934 BC, King Ashurbanipal II opened the age, not with a march on distant capitals, but with a program his inscriptions describe in the tones of a land agent, the recovery, year by methodical year, of the old Assyrian heartland. The districts lost in the dark centuries to Aramaean encroachment, whose Assyrian farmers had fled hunger and raids into the hills. He brought them back. His own words, "I returned the exhausted people of Assyria, who had abandoned their cities and houses in the face of want and hunger, and settled them in cities and houses that were suitable. He built ploughs by government issue, piled up grain reserves, restored walls and offices, and he punished, with exemplary thoroughness, the tribes that had presumed on Assyrian weakness." His successors, Adad-nirari II to Kulti-Ninurta II, continued the program outward in disciplined rings. Each spring the army marched, not yet to the ends of the earth, but to the next ring. The Kabur Valley, the Tigris passes, the grain plains east and west, reclaiming, refortifying, resettling. Each autumn it returned with plunder that financed the next spring. Historians call these decades the Reconquest, and the name catches the psychology exactly. In Assyrian eyes, nothing was being seized. Everything was being returned. The lands were Ashur's old estate, temporarily mismanaged by squatters, and the king's annals speak less like conquerors than like auditors restoring the accounts. It is dull. It worked, and it must be understood, because it built the platform for everything spectacular to come. Within 2 generations, Assyria had rebuilt the compact, rain-fed, road-knitted core, the deep keel of farmland, manpower, and fortress towns that every later adventure would sail on. Then, in 883 BC, there came to this well-tuned instrument a king who knew exactly what it could do, and meant the whole world to watch him do it. Ashurnasirpal II is the first Neo-Assyrian king the modern world met face to face. His are the palace reliefs Layard first broke into at Nimrud. His the serene, bearded image multiplied down museum halls. And he remains the reign in which the empire's doubled nature stands at its starkest, the 2 ledgers open side by side on one table. Begin with the ledger of magnificence. In the heart of the recovered kingdom, he raised a new capital, Kalhu, the Nimrud of the archaeologists, biblical Kala, a project of staggering scale on a bluff above the Tigris, a walled city of 360 hectares, a canal cut from the upper Zab to water its orchards and gardens. He lists the exotic trees he planted, delighting in them like a collector. Cedars, cypresses, junipers, almonds, dates, olives, 40-odd species gathered on campaign. Temples, a ziggurat, and above all the Northwest Palace, the prototype of every Assyrian royal palace to come. Courts and state apartments sheathed in carved alabaster, the walls an unbroken stone cinema of the king's wars, hunts, and rituals, winged lamassu at every major door, the whole once blazing with paint, its ceilings of cedar, its fittings of bronze, ivory, and gold. Nimrod's soil, 28 centuries later, was still paying dividends on that splendor. The carved ivories by the thousand that Malouin's teams lifted from its wells, his wife, Agatha Christie, cleaning them with her face cream and knitting needles beside the trench, and, in 1988, the tombs of the queens beneath the palace floor, untouched and holding one of the greatest golden treasures ever excavated anywhere. Crowns of golden vine leaves and winged spirits, bracelets and anklets by the kilogram, work of a fineness that stunned the field. And when the palace was finished, Ashurnasirpal did something no king had done, and inscribed the receipt so posterity could not doubt it. He threw a housewarming. The banquet of Nimrod, recorded on a stele down to the last jar. 69,574 guests, he counts. Dignitaries from every land, the whole population of the new capital, workmen included, feasted for 10 days on 1,000 fattened oxen, 10,000 sheep, 10,000 doves, 10,000 fish, 10,000 jars of beer, 10,000 skins of wine, and on down a menu of 100 lines. Thus did I honour them, the inscription closes, and sent them back to their lands in peace and joy. It is the greatest recorded party of the ancient world. Generosity itself weaponized as display, abundance as a form of awe. And now the other ledger, which the same king carved with the same care, sometimes on the same walls. For it was Ashurnasirpal who perfected the practice of publishing atrocity. His annals, composed in superb literary Akkadian, describe the fate of cities that resisted or rebelled in a tone of formal, almost liturgical ferocity. Rebels flayed, impaled, mutilated, burned, pillars of heads raised before broken gates, the language deliberate, repetitive, ceremonial, punishment recited like ritual. This fire does not linger in that room, and will not, but it must be entered honestly, because pretending the door is not there falsifies the whole house. 3 sober observations, and we move on. First, this was policy, not frenzy. Calculated terror, aimed at a precise economy. Assyria's compact core could not garrison the world. The annals and reliefs were engineered so that the world would garrison itself, the story of one city's fate marching ahead of the army to open the gates of 10 others without a blow. The texts were displayed, read aloud, translated. Fear was the cheapest soldier the empire had, and the king was its quartermaster. Second, it was reserved by explicit pattern for rebels and resistors. Submit, pay, and keep treaty, and the same annals record cities spared, kings confirmed, tribute graciously received. The system wanted revenue, not ruins, and said so. Third, the necessary modern footnote. Historians note that the annals are themselves propaganda, boasting of severities that were surely sometimes exaggerated for effect. The terror was real, but its advertisement was the true instrument. There it is, whole. The same administration that catalogued 40 species of garden trees catalogued the modes of execution. The host of the 10-day feast and the raiser of the pillars of heads were one methodical man, and the empire he modelled. Carrot of banquets, stick of annals, ledger of both. Is the model every successor refined? He died in bed, full of years and glory, and left the machine to a son who would run it for 35 unrelenting years, and who would collide at a river crossing in Syria with a small coalition whose muster roll contains a name that makes every reader of the Bible sit up straight. Shalmaneser III reigned 35 years and campaigned in 31 of them. The numbers alone sketch the man. Not a builder of visions like his father, but a soldier administrator of colossal stamina who took the perfected machine and simply ran it, west above all, against the one region that dared organize. For the states of Syria and the Levant, the Aramaean kingdoms led by Damascus, the Neo-Hittite cities, Phoenicia's ports, and the kingdom of Israel, had read the Nimrod annals correctly and drawn the rational conclusion. Separately, they were annual harvest. Together, they might be a wall. In 853 BC, at Karkar on the Orontes, the wall stood, a grand coalition. The inscriptions count a dozen kings. Met Shalmaneser head-on, and among the allied contingents the Assyrian scribe itemizes, with bureaucratic exactness, 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers of Ahab the Israelite. It is a small line with a large distinction. The first time anyone or anything from the Bible appears in a datable, contemporary, extra-biblical document. King Ahab of Israel, husband of Jezebel, stepping out of scripture into a quartermaster's list, fielding one of the largest chariot corps of the alliance. Shalmaneser, of course, claims a crushing victory. The enemy dead dammed the river. The plain was too small for the corpses to fall, and so on in the house style, the sober evidence. He came back and fought the same coalition again and again and again for a decade, says Stalemate. Karkar is the rare moment when the machine met organized collective resistance and stalled, a lesson about coalitions that both sides filed away. Time, however, fought for Assyria. The coalition did what coalitions do. It quarrelled, dissolved, and left its members to face the annual spring separately. Damascus was hammered. the Phoenician cities resumed paying, and Israel's new usurper king, Jehu, the furious chariot driver of the biblical account, exterminator of Ahab's house, calculated the new odds and bought safety in the standard currency. The receipt survives, and it is one of the most extraordinary objects in the British Museum. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser, a 2-meter pillar of polished black limestone found at Nimrod, its 4 faces carved in 5 registers of tribute processions from the empire's ends. Bactrian camels, elephants, monkeys, an unmistakably bewildered rhinoceros. And there, in the second register, a bearded figure in a soft cap prostrate on hands and knees, pressing his forehead to the ground before the standing king of Assyria, above a caption reading, "The tribute of Jehu, son of Omri. Silver, gold, a golden bowl, golden cups, tin, a staff for the king's hand." It is the only contemporary image in existence of any monarch of Israel or Judah. The face, or at least the bowed back, of a biblical king, rendered by the empire he knelt to. And no single object says the 9th century more completely. The world's smaller kingdoms learning, one by one, the posture the age required. Shalmaneser's own end, though, spoke the other recurring truth of Assyrian power. The rot that gathered at the top whenever the wars paused. His final years saw the aged king immobile in his capital, while a rebellion of his own eldest son tore the heartland. 27 cities, Ashur and Nineveh among them, against the crown. A civil war his younger son needed years to win, and the empire that emerged, exhausted, slid into 3 generations of drift. Strong queens and stronger courtiers here, history glimpses Samu Ramat, the regent queen behind the Greek legend of Semiramis, of whom more in her place, overmighty field marshals ruling the marches like private kings, provinces loosening, and a new storm. The kingdom of Urartu, rising formidable and organized in the northern mountains, pressing down on the trade roads. By 745 BC, the first superpower was, for the first time in 2 centuries, visibly failing. Contemporaries could be forgiven for assuming the Assyrian moment was passing, as all such moments had passed before. What actually happened was the opposite, and it turned on a single ruthless mind. A usurper of uncertain origin seized the throne in a palace coup, took the ancient name Tiglath-Pileser, and in 18 years rebuilt the empire so radically. Army, provinces, court, communications, everything, that historians speak of the reigns before him and after him almost as 2 different states. The machine was about to get its second, greater engine, and with it, the world's first true imperial system. Of the usurper's origins we know tantalizingly little. A governor, probably. A royal cousin, possibly. The coup of 745 BC that raised him arrived, suggestively, on the heels of plague and revolt. But of his work we know everything, because everything after him runs on it. Tiglath-Pileser III found an empire of loose tributaries managed by overmighty grandees, and in under 2 decades converted it into the first centrally administered territorial empire in world history. Not a zone of fear that paid, but a state that governed. The reforms interlock like gearing, and they are worth turning over one by one, because together they are the actual invention of the thing this whole night is about. He broke the magnates first. The huge hereditary marcher lordships that had swallowed the frontier were sliced into small provinces, each under a governor appointed by, promoted by, and removable by the king alone. And in a stroke of cold institutional genius, many key posts went to eunuchs. Men who could found no dynasty, whose loyalty had no grandchildren. He changed what conquest meant, where his predecessors had raided, extracted oaths, and ridden home, leaving client kings to relapse the moment the dust settled. Tiglath-Pileser annexed. Rebellious kingdoms ceased to exist as kingdoms and reappeared as provinces with an Assyrian governor, an Assyrian garrison, Assyrian weights in the market and the king's law in the gate. The empire stopped visiting and started staying. He made the deportations systematic, of which more, honestly, in its place. moving populations in both directions to break old loyalties and seed the provinces with mixed, dependent communities that owed everything to the crown. And he rebuilt the army from its social roots, the old seasonal levy of Assyrian farmers, brave but needed at harvest and bled white by 2 centuries of annual wars, was superseded by the standing royal army, the Kisir Sharuti. Professional regiments, paid, equipped, and drilled year-round from the empire's own arsenals, recruited increasingly from the conquered peoples themselves. Aramaean archers, Anatolian spearmen, and the matchless Nubian and later Iranian horse, folded under Assyrian officers into a war machine that no longer went home in autumn. War itself became a seasonless instrument of state, and the state, at last, had hands long enough to hold what the army took. Watch the new machine run once at full speed in the West, because the sequence became the empire's standard operating procedure and the terror of 3 continents. Stage 1. A kingdom. Say, one of the squabbling states of Syria or the Levant, accepts vassalage. It keeps its own king, pays fixed annual tribute, swears the loyalty oath before Ashur, and hosts, discreetly, the king's eyes, the kepu, the resident political officer whose reports ride east on the royal roads. Stage 2, upon a first rebellion. And rebellion, in the files, includes withholding tribute, corresponding with Egypt, or joining a coalition. The army arrives. The rebel king is replaced with a more compliant relative. Territory is shaved away into neighbouring provinces. Tribute rises. Hostages travel to Nineveh. Stage 3, upon a second rebellion. The kingdom is deleted. Dynasty deposed. Land annexed as a province. Elite deported. Foreign colonists settled in their houses. The map simply loses a name. The Bible itself watched the procedure devour the northern kingdom of Israel in exactly these stages across 3 decades. Tribute under Menahem, amputation under Pekah, deletion under Hoshea, the process completed by Tiglath-Pileser's successors with the fall of Samaria and the deportation of its people, the famous lost tribes, of whom more later, were stage 3, experienced from below. To his contemporaries, the procedural, escalating, paper-driven relentlessness of it was something genuinely new under the sun. Not the old lion pounce of ancient war, but a bureaucratic gravity, patient and inescapable. Small kingdoms now navigated the world as men navigate a legal system that ends in an executioner. Tiglath-Pileser capped the structure personally in 729 BC by solving, for a time, the oldest problem in the file. Babylon, forever holy, forever restive. Not by sack, but by absorption. He took the crown of Babylon himself, ruling the south as its legitimate king under a second royal name, one man wearing both diadems. He died in his bed months later, master of the largest and best organized state the human race had yet produced. And history, which loves irony, gave the machine's perfecter a quiet exit and reserved its drama for the house that followed. A short-reigned son, and then another usurping strongman who reached, for his throne name, all the way back to the most glorious name in Mesopotamian memory, Sargon. Sargon II, the true king, as the borrowed name of Akkad's ancient founder proclaimed, with the special emphasis of men whose claim needs proclaiming, took the throne in 722 BC amid revolts on every horizon, and spent 17 furious years proving the borrowed name honest. The resume is the machine at full imperial stretch. Samaria's fall completed, and Israel's elite marched east. The deportation lists survive. 27,290 persons, counted with the empire's terrible bookkeeping. The Egyptian-backed risings of the Levant broken at Raphia on Sinai's edge. The first time Assyrian and Egyptian armies ever crossed spears, opening the duel of superpowers that would shape the next century. The eternal Babylonian problem reopened by a Chaldean tribal chief named Merodach-Baladan. Remember the name, it returns. Who seized Babylon and held it for a decade before Sargon ground him out of it, and, in the north, the reign's masterpiece, the 8th campaign against Urartu, the mountain rival. A war of high passes and fortress lakes that Sargon commemorated in a unique document, a magnificent literary dispatch to the god Ashur himself, part battle report, part travel epic. The army hauling through forests where no king had passed, the surprise descent, the shattering of the Urartian host, and the sack of the holy city of Musasir, its temple treasury inventoried in the report down to the last bronze bucket. The god receiving, as it were, an itemized receipt for his estate's expansion. Urartu never fully recovered. The northern threat that had shadowed Assyria for a century was broken on that campaign. At the summit, Sargon did what Assyrian kings at summits did, and overdid it in the grand manner. He built a capital from nothing. Dur-Sharrukin, fortress of Sargon, modern Khorsabad, a perfect square of city wall enclosing 3 square kilometers of virgin ground, a palace of 200 rooms on a made platform, Lamassu at the gates twice a man's height, the whole rising in about a decade under a correspondence of which hundreds of letters survive. The king demanding progress reports, officials excusing delays, requisitions for straw and stone, and deportee labour, the paperwork of a wonder of the world. He inaugurated it with festival in 706 BC. He enjoyed it for roughly a year. In 705, campaigning in the Anatolian highlands against a raiding people the sources call the Cimmerians, Sargon, old, glorious, and present in person as Assyrian kings always were, was killed in battle, and, in the detail that detonated through the empire's soul, his body was not recovered. To the Assyrian mind, this was not military misfortune, it was theological catastrophe. A king of the universe slain by barbarians and left unburied. No tomb, no rites, a royal ghost wandering hungry. Could only mean some enormous hidden sin punished by the gods. The scholars were set to combing the omens and archives for what Sargon had done wrong. A surviving text agonizes over precisely this question. His own son and heir abandoned the year-old dream capital almost at once, leaving Dur-Sharrukin as history's most magnificent white elephant. A nearly unused wonder, occupied by caretakers, its name so thoroughly forgotten that its modern rediscoverers first mistook it for Nineveh. 2.5 millennia later, the site would suffer a second, modern tragedy, of which more near our journey's end. The son who turned his back on his father's city, shaken, the texts suggest, into a lifelong wariness of his father's very name, moved the court to the ancient city on the Tigris whose greatest age was about to begin. His name was Sennacherib, the city was Nineveh, and together they are the next and grandest act of the whole story. Sennacherib came to the throne in 705 BC under his father's dark star and spent a 24-year reign outshining it, not by founding a new city, which the omen of Dur-Sharrukin had cursed forever, but by transfiguring the oldest one. Nineveh had stood on its 2 mounds by the Tigris for as long as memory ran. A temple town of Ishtar time out of mind, a royal residence off and on for centuries. Sennacherib made it the capital of the world, and his building inscriptions, which survive in wonderful abundance, let us watch the metropolis rise year by year through the eyes of its obsessed creator. The city wall went up first in his counting. 12 kilometers of circuit, 100 feet of height in the proud numbers, with 15 gates, each bearing a program name like a proclamation. The Gate of the Gardens, the Desert Gate, the Quay Gate, the gate called the One Who Overwhelms All Enemies. Within, the old town was surveyed anew. Streets widened and straightened. The king fixed the width of the great processional avenue by royal decree and, the inscription adds with characteristic Sennacherib menace, provided that anyone whose house encroached upon it would be impaled upon his own roof. An urban code enforced, one might say, with emphasis. Parks and orchards ringed the quarters. The king collected exotic flora and fauna the way his ancestor had, planting olives and vines. Cotton from the east, the wool-bearing trees of the inscriptions, sheared and woven as a marvel. Marsh cane brakes stocked with wild boar for the royal hunt. And at the summit of the citadel mound rose the project of projects, which Sennacherib named without blushing the palace without rival, a complex vaster than any before it. The excavators traced halls running 200 meters. Raised on a platform of millions of bricks, gated by lamassu of white limestone and colossal copper-cast pillar bases, the king describes founding with new bronze-working techniques of his own devising. He was, among his other qualities, a genuine engineering enthusiast, forever explaining his innovations. In casting, lifting, and well machinery with the pride of an inventor, its walls sheathed in kilometre upon kilometre of carved relief. The campaigns, the building works themselves. One famous sequence shows a winged bull being quarried, sledged, and levered into place by gangs of labourers under the king's own supervision. The whole painted, gilded, cedar-roofed, and staffed by the tribute of 3 continents. But the masterpiece, the work that makes hydraulic engineers whistle to this day, was invisible from the throne room. Water. A capital of perhaps 100,000 people, with gardens to shame legend, needed more water than the little river Kossa and the seasonal rains could give, and Sennacherib went and took it from the mountains. In stages across his reign, his engineers built a water supply network reaching ultimately some 95 kilometers into the hills northeast of Nineveh. Weirs and dams on the mountain streams, canals contour cut along the flanks of the hills, their intakes carved with reliefs of the king and his gods still visible in the rock today. And where the great canal from the Gomel Gorge had to cross a valley at Jerwan, the astonishing thing itself. A true stone aqueduct bridge, 300 meters long, 22 wide, carried on pointed corbelled arches, built of some 2 million dressed limestone blocks, bearing the royal inscription. Over deep-cut ravines I spanned a bridge of white stone. Those waters I caused to pass over upon it. It stands there yet, in Iraqi Kurdistan, the oldest aqueduct of its kind on earth, its blocks scattered but its bulk unmistakable. Proof in limestone that centuries before Rome existed, Assyrian engineers were moving rivers across valleys because a king wanted greener gardens. And those gardens hold, for us, a delicious modern mystery, flagged as the theory it is. Sennacherib describes, beside his palace, a high garden built like a wonder. An artificial mountain of terraces planted with trees, watered by devices he boasts of inventing, raising water continuously to the heights his description of bronze water-raising screws would predate Archimedes by 4 centuries. And a relief from his grandson's palace shows exactly such a garden. Trees on arched terraces, an aqueduct feeding it, a pillared pavilion on top. Put that beside the awkward facts that no trace of hanging gardens has ever been found at Babylon, that Babylon's own copious records never mention them, and that later writers demonstrably confuse the 2 cities. And you have the modern scholarly proposal, seriously argued and seriously received, that the hanging gardens of Babylon, lone phantom among the 7 wonders, may have been real after all. At Nineveh, built by Sennacherib, misfiled by legend. The fire offers it as it is offered, unproven, delightful, and pending under the mounds. What is proven is the sum. Within a generation, Sennacherib had made Nineveh what the prophet's book calls it with hostile awe. That great city, the largest, most engineered, most spectacular urban creation the world had yet seen. He had also, in the same years, been conducting the empire's wars, and 2 of them, one in the west against a small kingdom with a large future, and one in the south against the holy city itself, would mark his name longer than all the limestone on the Tigris. The Western crisis came first, and it has the rare distinction of being narrated to us from both sides of the wall. On Sargon's death, half the empire had tested the new king, and the Levantine revolt of 701 BC was Egypt-backed, coalition-shaped, and centered on the kingdom of Judah under its vigorous king Hezekiah, who had fortified Jerusalem, cut the famous water tunnel that still channels the Gihon Spring under the old city. Its workmen's jubilant meeting in the middle inscription survives, and withheld tribute. Sennacherib's 3rd campaign rolled down the coast in the standard sequence. Phoenician cities resubmitted. Philistine ringleaders were replaced. An Egyptian relief army was met and beaten at El Teke, and Judah was then systematically reduced. 46 walled towns taken by the king's count, and the fate of the fortress of Lachish, 2nd city of the kingdom, was carved at panoramic length on the walls of the palace without rival, where Layard found it. The complete anatomy of an Assyrian siege in stone. The ramp, the engines, the archers and slingers rank on rank, the defenders on the towers, the breach, the file of captives with their carts and children going into exile past the enthroned king. the single most detailed picture of ancient warfare that survives, and the excavated mound of Lachish itself, with its siege ramps still in place and its arrowheads where they fell, confirms the reliefs like a photograph confirming a painting. Then the army closed on Jerusalem. And here the two accounts perform their famous duet. Sennacherib's annals, Hezekiah the Judean, who did not submit to my yoke. Him I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage, the countryside stripped, the towns distributed to Philistine vassals, and a crushing tribute enumerated. 30 talents of gold, silver by the hundredweight, treasures, musicians, the king's own daughters, sent after me to Nineveh. What the annals do not say is the word every other campaign account says, taken. Jerusalem, uniquely on the itinerary, was not taken. The Bible's account agrees on the siege, striking detail, on the exact figure of 30 talents of gold in tribute, and then tells the rest as miracle. The angel of the Lord passing through the Assyrian camp by night, the army decimated, the great king withdrawing to Nineveh. The Greek historian Herodotus, centuries later, preserves an Egyptian tale of the same campaign wrecked by a plague of mice gnawing the army's bowstrings. Mice, plague, and sudden camp death keep suspicious company in ancient stories, and many historians suspect epidemic disease did in fact strike the besiegers. Others note simply that Hezekiah's submission and colossal tribute gave Sennacherib everything the system required without the cost of storming the age's most defensible hill city. Both books, at any rate, close the file the same way. Jerusalem stood, stripped but unsacked. A survival with consequences beyond all proportion, for the little city's deliverance, read as divine, hardened into a theology of inviolability that would shape the next century of its choices, and the religion born on that hill would eventually outlast every empire in this story. Assyria itself merely moved to the next file. But the next file was Babylon, and Babylon would cost Sennacherib his peace, his patience, and at last his life. Babylon was the empire's insoluble equation, the holy city. Mother of the culture, seat of Marduk, revered by the Assyrians themselves, whose scholars wrote its language and whose kings craved its blessing. And simultaneously the empire's most incorrigible rebel, where Chaldean tribal lords, Elamite gold, and civic pride brewed revolt as regularly as the date harvest. Sennacherib tried everything in the manual across 20 years, ruling it gently through appointees, installing his own beloved eldest son as its king. Whereupon the Babylonians' Elamite allies kidnapped the young man and delivered him to his death, a wound the sources let us feel through the marble. Punitive campaigns, a colossal combined arms expedition. Phoenician-built ships hauled overland to hunt the eternal Merodach Baladan through the southern marshes. And at last, after Babylon rose yet again behind an Elamite alliance and fought the empire to a bloody standstill at Halule, Sennacherib's patience snapped along its theological grain. In 689 BC, he took the city and did the unthinkable. Not a sack, but an execution. The annals describe, in tones of deliberate, shocking totality, the temples and towers overthrown, the rubble shoveled into the canals, the Euphrates turned through the ruins to drown the foundations, the very soil carried off in ships. The holy city formally erased, its gods deported, Marduk's statue carried to Assyria as Tukulti-Ninurta had carried it half a millennium before, and to much the same end. For pious Mesopotamians everywhere, including, crucially, within Assyria, the deed was cosmic sacrilege, a king raising his hand against heaven's own order, and when, 8 years later, the account came due, no one in the ancient world doubted the ledger it was drawn on. In 681 BC, Sennacherib was murdered in a temple, struck down, the sources agree, by his own sons. Elder princes passed over in the succession, who cut their father down among the gods of Babylonian chronicle, and the Bible concur on parricide. A later text adds the detail of the king crushed beneath a toppled colossus, which may be moral poetry, and plunged the empire into civil war. Out of that war, against the odds, came neither of the assassins but the young son Sennacherib had chosen. a prince who had watched his father die of Babylon in every sense, and who would spend his own anxious, remarkable reign trying to balance the cosmic books, rebuilding the holy city with one hand, conquering Egypt with the other, and hiding, when the omens turned black, behind the strangest ritual in the history of monarchy. His name was Esarhaddon, and his is the strangest, most human file in the whole royal archive. Esarhaddon won his throne sword in hand, a winter countermarch on Nineveh, while his parricide brothers' coalition dissolved before him, the brothers fleeing into exile, and reigned 12 years as the most paradoxical great king of the ancient world. Outwardly, the most successful conqueror his dynasty ever produced. Inwardly, thanks to an accident of preservation, the most intimately known and the most fragile. For the state correspondence of his court survives by the hundreds of letters, and through them we watch a superpower governed by a man in chronic ill health. The physician's reports track fevers, skin disease, days when the king would not eat or leave his chambers, depressions the letters tiptoe around, and in chronic spiritual dread. Son of a murdered father who had himself murdered a holy city, Esarhaddon lived as if the cosmos held a warrant with his name on it, and he retained, on permanent staff, the largest establishment of protective scholarship ever assembled. Astrologers watching the sky from observatories across the empire and reporting by express post. Haruspices reading the livers of sacrificed lambs before every decision. Exorcists, dream interpreters, lamentation priests. The whole learned apparatus of Mesopotamian divination, running at imperial scale as a kind of celestial intelligence service, its daily product flowing to a king who read it all. The letters are irresistibly human, scholars jockeying for favour and sniping at rivals' interpretations. A report soothing the king that the eclipse touched Babylonia's quadrant, not Assyria's. The chief exorcist gently protesting that His Majesty has asked the same anxious question 3 times. The king, between omens, fussing over a grandchild's health. And when the omens turned truly black, a lunar eclipse of the wrong colour in the wrong month, portending the death of the king. The court deployed the strangest instrument in the whole ritual arsenal, attested repeatedly in this very reign. The substitute king, a condemned man or simpleton, was enthroned in full ceremony. Robed, crowned, seated on the throne, addressed as Majesty, given a queen. While the true king withdrew into seclusion under the title the farmer, wearing plain clothes and answering to no royal address, the substitute reigned his 100 days, absorbing the doom the stars had decreed for the crown. And when the term ended, the doom was. The source is a matter of fact where we would flinch. Punctually delivered, the substitute and his queen went to their deaths with royal honours and a state funeral, the omen fulfilled, the true king resuming his throne. The cosmos satisfied by substitution as an account is satisfied by payment. It happened at least 3 times in this reign. The empire of iron pausing at full operational tempo to run a 100-day theological decoy. And no single institution says more plainly what power felt like from inside the palace. The master of the world, hiding from the sky in a farmer's coat. Yet the same trembling hand steered the empire to its maximum extent, and steered it shrewdly. His first great act reversed his father's greatest. Babylon would be rebuilt. The decree framed with exquisite theological bookkeeping. Marduk, the inscriptions explain, had decreed 70 years of desolation, but the merciful God turned the tablet upside down, and the cuneiform signs for 70, inverted, read 11. Heaven itself amending the sentence? And the rebuilding proceeded in earnest. Walls, temples, the exiled citizens recalled, the king of Assyria carrying the builder's basket in ritual humility on the very rubble his father had made. It was policy as atonement and atonement as policy. The South conciliated for a generation, and it set up the reign's famous dynastic experiment, of which more shortly. Westward and southward, meanwhile, the machine ran at full thrust. The perennial Egyptian interference in the Levant was answered, at last, at its source. After one failed attempt taught the lessons, Esarhaddon in 671 BC did what no Mesopotamian ruler had ever done. He crossed the Sinai. The march itself, an epic of logistics. The annals describing water carried on camels supplied by Arab client chiefs through a desert of two-headed serpents, the quartermaster's memory of terror embroidered. Shattered the pharaoh Taharka's army in 3 battles, took Memphis in half a day, captured the crown prince and the harem, and enthroned Assyrian governors over the Nile. Delta, Egypt, the other superpower, the eternal counterweight, was a Assyrian province. The empire now ran, as the titles swelled to say, from the upper sea to the lower sea and over Egypt's lower land. The largest state the human species had yet produced, and the first to unite the 2 ancient river worlds, Nile and Euphrates, under one crown. Esarhaddon celebrated in stone at Zincirli, with a victory stele showing the pharaoh's son and a Levantine king kneeling on leashes. And then, being Esarhaddon, went home and consulted the omens about what heaven would take in payment. He did not have long to learn. Egypt revolted the moment his back turned, as Egypt always would, and marching west in 669 BC to answer, the anxious conqueror died on the road, of illness, in his bed, in camp. The one Assyrian death, perhaps, that the omens had never managed to schedule. He left behind the strangest and farthest-seeing testament of any Assyrian king. The succession settled years in advance by a device part constitution and part curse. The empire divided between 2 sons, the younger, his favourite, to rule Assyria and the world as great king, the elder to hold the rebuilt Babylon as its own king beneath him. And the whole arrangement imposed on every vassal ruler and official of the empire by a colossal loyalty oath. The succession treaty of Esarhaddon, copies of which have been excavated from Nimrud to southeastern Anatolia, hundreds of lines binding the swearer and his descendants to uphold the settlement, sealed by the most comprehensive curse catalogue antiquity ever drafted. May the gods make your ground like iron, your sky like bronze. May you eat in your hunger the flesh of your children. A document whose formulas, scholars have long noted, echo strikingly in the covenant curses of the biblical book of Deuteronomy, composed in a vassal kingdom that had sworn exactly such oaths. Assyrian imperial legalese, transposed into scripture, outliving the empire by 26 centuries and counting. Thus the anxious king arranged the future to the last curse. The younger son duly took the world throne without a ripple. The treaty, for a decade, worked. His name was Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, the most learned monarch of antiquity, the lion hunter, the librarian, and the man in whose glittering, erudite, fratricidal reign the first superpower would reach its absolute zenith and, without anyone noticing, begin to die. Ashurbanipal announces himself, in his own inscriptions, with a boast no king before him had ever thought worth making. The military virtues are all present and correct. The archery, the horsemanship, the chariotry. But then comes the astonishing paragraph. I learned the craft of the sage Adapa, the hidden treasure of all scribal knowledge. I can resolve complex mathematical divisions and multiplications that have no easy solution. I have read cunningly written texts in obscure Sumerian and Akkadian that are difficult to interpret. I have examined stone inscriptions from before the flood. The king of the universe is bragging about his reading level, and the brag was true. Trained in boyhood for the temple or the chancery while an elder brother stood heir, then vaulted to the succession by his father's anxious testament. Ashurbanipal came to the throne in 669 BC as the only monarch of the ancient Near East who could personally read, write, and argue the scholarship his predecessors had merely employed. Tablets survive bearing what are claimed as the king's own exercises, and his letters cite omens back at his own experts, chapter and verse. Reliefs make the point with a detail unique in royal art anywhere. Ashurbanipal, in scenes of war and of leisure alike, carries a stylus tucked in his belt beside the sword. No pharaoh, no Caesar, no medieval emperor is portrayed so. The first superpower's last great king is the ancient world's one unambiguous image of power that reads. The reign the scholar conducted was, for 3 decades, the empire at absolute zenith. And its wars, which he directed increasingly from Nineveh, while the machine executed a departure his critics ancient and modern have noted. The first great Assyrian king who did not habitually lead in person were the machine's most terrible performances. Egypt first. The revolt his father died marching against was crushed in 2 campaigns, the second driving deeper than any Asian army had ever gone. Thebes itself, the 1,000-year holy city of the south, sacked in 663 BC, its treasures and 2 great obelisks carried to Nineveh. The shock rang around the ancient world. The prophet Nahum would still be invoking the fall of Thebes decades later as the measure of catastrophe, though Assyrian Egypt itself proved unholdable at such range and was quietly conceded within a generation to a compliant client dynasty. The empire's grasp, for the first time visibly, exceeding its reach. Elam next. The old eastern rival, Babylon's eternal enabler across 1,000 years of meddling. Provoked once too often, Ashurbanipal broke it in a series of wars culminating in 647 BC with the sack of Susa, one of the most complete erasures in ancient history, narrated by the king with a new and chilling refinement. Not just the city destroyed, but its civilization formally unmade, the temples razed and their gods deported. The royal tombs of Elam opened, and the bones of its ancient kings carried off to be denied rest. The sacred groves burned, salt and thorns sown, the very silence afterward inventoried. The voice of humanity, the tread of cattle and sheep, the joyful harvest song. I banished them from its fields. Assyria's oldest rivalry ended in a demonstration that the empire could kill not merely armies, but memory. And the demonstration, as we shall see, taught the wrong students. Among the hill peoples who moved into broken Elam's vacuum were the Persians, whose first royal house now planted itself in Elamite Anshan and watched and learned and waited. But the reign's central wound was domestic, and their father's careful treaty had written it. The elder brother, Shamash-Shumukin, sat as king of Babylon. A real king of a real and rebuilt kingdom, yet forever beneath the younger sibling in Nineveh. And after 16 years of smiling correspondence, the arrangement failed exactly as human nature, if not treaty law, predicted. In 652 BC, the elder brother razed the whole south. Babylon, the Chaldean tribes, Elam, the Arabs, a grand coalition of everyone with a grievance. In the most dangerous rebellion the empire ever faced, 4 years of full-scale civil war, brother against brother, the succession treaty's curses invoked on both sides. Assyria's machine, even against half the world, ground out its verdict. The coalition beaten in the field. Babylon invested and starved through a siege of horrors the chronicles shudder at, until in 648 the city fell and Shamash-Shumukin died in its flames. In later legend, hurling himself onto his own pyre, the original of the Greek Sardanapalus burning amid his splendours. The historical texts say only that the gods consigned him to the fire. Ashurbanipal's inscriptions mourn and rage in the same breath. My faithless brother. And the king punished the rebellion's abettors with the Susa campaign and with a desert war against the Arabs, whose reliefs show camel riders fleeing Assyrian cavalry, the first great camel war in art. The empire emerged victorious, intact, and hollowed. The treasury drained by the costliest war in its history. The southern hatred banked deeper than ever beneath the ashes. Egypt gone. Elam a vacuum filling with tomorrow's enemies. The crown prince generation decimated by the fratricide. None of it showed on the surface. The surface, in the 640s, was the most brilliant any empire had yet worn. And at its centre, in the palace without rival, and a gleaming new North Palace beside it, the scholar king was assembling, with conqueror's methods and collector's love, the project by which, alone among all the works of Assyria, he would genuinely rule forever. Ashurbanipal's library was not an accumulation. It was a campaign, planned, ordered, and executed with the same systematic totality the empire brought to provinces and the orders survive. To his agents in Babylonia went directives that read like requisitions. Seek out and send me the rare tablets. The ritual series named by name, the omen collections, whatever is needed for the palace, tablets for which no copies exist in Assyria. Seize the libraries of temples and scholars, where owners will not yield originals, make copies. Teams of scribes in the conquered south spent years copying the classics onto fresh clay for shipment north. Scholars' private collections arrived as war booty from Babylon after the Brothers' War, catalogued by origin. And in Nineveh, a corps of royal scribes edited, collated, and standardized, producing authorized editions of the great text series. Each tablet numbered in sequence. Tablet 11 of the series, He Who Saw the Deep, reads a colophon we will bless in a moment, catalogued by opening line and stamped with the ex libris of power. Palace of Ashurbanipal, king of the universe, king of Assyria. Followed, on many, by a book curse threatening whoever removes the tablet with the wrath of the gods and the erasure of his name. The result, housed in chambers of the two great palaces, was the first systematically collected universal library in human history. Some 30,000 tablets and fragments, as the modern museum counts them, aspiring, explicitly, to contain the whole of Mesopotamian written knowledge. The Omen series in their hundreds of tablets, celestial, terrestrial, liver, dream. The empire's decision support literature, medicine. Diagnostic handbooks and prescription collections, disease by disease, mathematics and astronomy. The dictionaries and sign lists of a scholarship already 2,000 years deep and bilingual in dead Sumerian. Rituals, prayers, lamentations, royal archives and correspondence. And the shelf that changed the modern world. The literature, creation epics, the descent of Ishtar, wisdom debates, proverbs, and the crown of the whole tradition, the Epic of Gilgamesh in its standard 12-tablet edition. The oldest great work of world literature, the king who sought immortality and came home with a story instead, preserved for humanity almost entirely because one Assyrian king wanted a complete set. And then, the turn that gives this part its place in the night. The library performed the trick for which it will be remembered as long as memory lasts. It was saved by the apocalypse. When Nineveh fell, a few decades after the collector's death, the palace is burned, and fire, which annihilates parchment, paper, and papyrus, does something else entirely to clay. It bakes it. The shelves collapsed. The tablets rained into the burning rooms and were buried under the roof fall. Fired hard, sealed in rubble, and thereby placed beyond every enemy that has ever destroyed a library. Damp, worms, war, zealotry, recycling, and time. The universal libraries of the later ancient world. Alexandria itself, perished to the last scroll. The library of Nineveh, murdered in an afternoon, survived almost entire, and waited 24.5 centuries under the mound for Layard's and Rassam's workmen, whence it travelled to London to detonate quietly through modern thought, George Smith undressing over the flood tablet, Gilgamesh returning to the world's bookshelves after 2.5 millennia of silence, Babylonian astronomy revealing the roots of Greek science, the Omen series and dictionaries opening the whole cuneiform world of which every prior chapter of this night is the beneficiary. Pause on the design of the irony, because the story rarely offers one so perfect. Of everything Assyria built, the walls, the armies, the terror, the provinces, the aqueducts. The sole creation that achieved the immortality every king carved demands for was the one assembled with a stylus. The empire's true rival-less palace turned out to be a bookshelf, and the king of the universe rules today over exactly the territory he claimed in his strangest boast, the written word, and over nothing else at all. His statue stands now, stylus at his belt, outside a great library in San Francisco. The Scholar King would note the location, consult no omens, and be content. He died around 631 BC, in circumstances the record leaves dark. The last years of the reign are, fittingly and fatally, among the worst documented of the empire. And with him, though not a soul in glittering Nineveh could have believed it, the story has reached the cliff edge. The first superpower has, at this point in our night, perhaps 20 years to live. But before we watch it fall, we owe the machine itself a closer tour. The army, the roads, the files, the deportation caravans, the anatomy of the thing that is about to die. Walk through the royal arsenal city at Nineveh's southern corner. Sennacherib built it and called it the Palace of Governance, a walled military city within the city, its magazine courts vast enough to marshal an army corps, and review, as the king reviewed, the instrument itself. The Assyrian army of the imperial age was history's first standing professional force, first integrated multi-arms system, first military that treated war as year-round state industry rather than seasonal adventure, and its parts, assembled over 2 centuries of reform, deserve their portrait. The infantry corps, spearmen with iron-tipped weapons and great shields, archers by the 10,000. Assyria fielded archery at a density no rival matched, each archer paired in assault with a shield-bearer, the 2-man team, the basic molecule of its firepower. Slingers whose lead and stone outranged arrows plunging from siege ramps. The cavalry, Assyria's great conversion. The chariot, aristocratic queen of Bronze Age battle, was progressively demoted to command platform and shock reserve as the empire, fighting ever deeper into mountains where wheels die, built the first true cavalry arm in the world's history. Riders paired at first, one to hold reins while the other shot. The reliefs record the learning curve mastering the horse archer's art on Iranian mounts until royal squadrons could do what chariots never could. Pursue defeated enemies to destruction across any terrain, the tactical innovation that turned victories from expulsions into annihilations. The engineers, the arm the world truly feared. No fortress strategy could checkmate an army that took cities as routine. Earthen siege ramps engineered over rubble fill Lachish's still stands, wheeled towers and the iconic Assyrian ram. A turreted machine with a leather-armoured prow, archers firing from its top while the iron-shod beam swung below. Miners tunneling walls under mantlet cover. The reliefs even show inflatable goatskin floats on which assault infantry swam moats and rivers. Combat engineering, hydraulics, and logistics fused into a single profession centuries before anyone else separated them. And behind everything, the true weapon, organization. The muster rolls and depots, the remount studs breeding cavalry horses as state enterprise, the arsenals issuing standardized iron, a single Sargonid magazine at Khorsabad yielded 200 tons of iron implements to its excavators. The stockpile of a state that counted its metal like grain, the roads and bridge trains that moved corp at 25 kilometers a day on schedule, the intelligence files choosing the target before the first boot marched. Set against this, the age's other armies. Brave levies around palace guards were not so much outfought as outsystematized. Assyria's neighbors experienced its army less as an enemy than as a natural force with a bureaucracy. One more feature completes the portrait, and it surprises. The machine was profoundly multinational. Defeated soldiers were folded wholesale into the rank's entire corps of Israelite charioteers, Aramaean archers, Elamite bowmen appear on the rolls, governed by Assyrian officers and the king's oath. The first superpower's army was, like every superpower since, a mirror of its conquests, the empire fighting itself forward with the hands of everyone it had already absorbed. Armies win provinces, systems keep them, and Assyria's deepest invention was the nervous system it strung across its body, the first imperial communications network in history, the direct ancestor, via Persia's famous copy, of every royal road and postal relay the world has known. The spine was the hollow way, the King's Road. Engineered routes radiating from the capitals to every provincial seat, graded for wheeled traffic, bridged at the rivers, furnished at intervals of a day's stage with the innovation itself, the road stations. State caravanserais stocked with fresh mules, fodder, water, and beds, at which the express service changed animals and rode on. A royal dispatch, relayed rider to rider through the stations, could cross the 700 kilometers from the western Euphrates to the heartland in a handful of days, a speed of government no state had ever possessed. The tablets preserved the system's paperwork, the sealed waypasses entitling a courier to remounts, the complaints of officials whose region skimped its mule quota, even a governor's grumble that the express is for state business, not private letters. The eternal voice of the transport office. Along the roads flowed the empire's blood, the tribute caravans and army columns, of course, but above all information. For the road system's true cargo was the state correspondence, and its survival lets us watch the first superpower think. Thousands of letters between the kings and their governors, magnates, and agents have been excavated from the capital's archives, and their range is the range of government itself. Harvest reports and grain price bulletins, fortress commandants on the Urartian frontier reporting enemy troop movements, road conditions, the interrogation of deserters, the horse purchasing officers of the remount service, customs posts logging caravans, and everywhere the kepu, the resident political officers at vassal courts, reporting the private conversations of client kings with a candour their hosts would have paid dearly to read. This was an intelligence service in the full sense. The crown ran networks of informers across the frontier zones. A famous file tracks Urartu's internal crisis after its defeat by the Sumerians, sourced from merchants, deserters, and paid men, cross-checked between stations like any modern desk. And its product drove policy, campaigns launched or shelved on the winter's reporting, rebellions forestalled by a governor's arrest. The whole vast body steered by a continuous stream of provincial fact that no earlier state had ever commanded. Historians reach naturally for the modern words: postal service, intelligence agency, standing bureaucracy. And for once, the words are not anachronism but genealogy. Persia inherited the roads and stations and named them. Rome inherited Persia's idea. The world inherited Rome's. When a letter crosses a continent tonight in the time it takes to read this sentence, it travels a lineage that begins with a mule changing hands at a brick way station on the Nineveh road, under a waypass sealed by the king of the universe. And now the fire must sit with the machine's heaviest gear, and count it honestly on both pans of the scale, because no institution was more central to the empire, or more consequential for the world, than mass deportation. The numbers first, in the empire's own bookkeeping. Across 3 centuries, the royal inscriptions record the forced resettlement of some 4.5 million human beings. The figure is the total of the king's own claims, and even discounted for boasting it, describes population transfer as a permanent instrument of state, applied after nearly every major conquest. Israelites to Media and the Chabur, Babylonians to the coast, Elamites, Arabs, Anatolians, Egyptians, shuffled across the map like a gardener transplanting stock, which is precisely the metaphor the texts use. The policy's logic was cold and complete, rebellion decapitated. A deported elite cannot plot in exile among strangers, provinces ceded. Empty or restive lands received loyal because dependent settlers who owed their houses to the crown. Skills harvested. Craftsmen, scribes, and soldiers were sorted like booty, Israelite chariotry driving straight into the royal core, Phoenician shipwrights to the arsenals, and the capitals built. The labouring multitudes on Sennacherib's reliefs, hauling the winged bulls, are the uprooted, spending their exile on the wonder of the world, now the honest weighing. In the dark pan, the thing itself. Whole communities marched from their ancestral lands under escort. The uprooting of violence no administrative language softens. The marches were suffered, families were sundered, the reliefs themselves, with strange candour, show the columns, the carts, the children on shoulders, the backward glances, and entire peoples. The 10 northern tribes of Israel, most famously, were dissolved into the empire's bloodstream and vanished from history as peoples. The lost tribes are this policy's monument, and the world's literature of exile begins in its shadow. In the other pan, what must in fairness be said? Assyrian deportation was resettlement, not extermination. The state's own interest demanded the deportees arrive alive and productive, and the files prove the interest was enforced. Provisioning orders for the columns and official is instructed to issue bread, oil, and shoes, and is held accountable for losses, allocations of land, seed, and houses at the destination. Deportees appearing a generation later in the records as farmers, soldiers, priests, and officials of standing. The policy transplanted lives rather than ending them, and its own cold efficiency was the deportees' grim protection. And history must record the deepest consequence, which no king intended. The blender created the world it left behind. For the great mixing dissolved 100 local tongues into the empire's practical common speech, Aramaic, which thereby became the first world language of the Near East, the language Jesus would speak 6 centuries later, the ancestor of the very tongue, as our journey's end will hear, that Assyrian villagers speak today. And the uprooted communities, holding to identity without territory, pioneered under Assyrian duress the arts of diaspora. The portable faith, the remembered homeland, the community as text. That would shape the religious history of the entire world. The gear was iron. What it ground out was, among much sorrow, the connected, polyglot, mixed Near East of every later age. Both pans true, the fire holds them and moves on. Into the city all the roads and caravans fed, for the tour it has earned. Nineveh alive, at street level, on an ordinary imperial evening. Come back through the gate where our night began. Under the stone smile of the Lamassu, in the last hour of daylight, around 650 BC, with Ashurbanipal on the throne and the empire at flood tide. And let the greatest city on earth simply happen around you for a while. The first impression, every visitor's first impression, is sound. Nineveh at evening is a sea of languages. Akkadian in the offices, Aramaic in the streets, the empire's practical tongue, chattering from every stall. Phoenician on the wharves, Egyptian, Elamite, the hill dialects of a dozen mountain peoples. Hebrew in the quarter, where Israelite families 3 generations settled now run workshops and serve in the guard. The whole known world compressed inside, 12 kilometers of wall, and talking at once. Follow the crowd up the great processional avenue. Sennacherib's pride, wide as a parade ground, resurfaced and jealously protected by royal decree. Toward the citadel, past the establishments of the imperial economy. The counting houses of the merchant families, whose caravans link the Iranian roads to the Phoenician ports. The offices where scribes for hire write letters in 2 scripts. Cuneiform pressed into clay, Aramaic inked on leather, the old world and the new writing side by side at the same tables. The workshops of the crown. Weavers of the palace wools, ivory carvers fitting Phoenician-style plaques for furniture, the bronze casters and iron smiths whose quarter announces itself by smoke and clangor, the markets where the tribute of 3 continents retails at street level, Egyptian linen and Median horses, Anatolian silver, Arabian incense, dates from the brother king's Babylon, dried fish from the Gulf. The traffic parts, twice for the machine, a courier of the express, mud to the thighs, riding the last stage from the western road with a sealed dispatch that will be in the palace before the light fails, and a column of labourers. Deportees by their dress and their sadness, Elamites perhaps, new stock from the Eastern Wars, marching under escort toward the arsenal works, both faces of the empire, passing each other in the same street, in the same minute, without a glance. Climb, as the lamps come on, to the citadel mound. Kuyunjik, the modern diggers call it, where the empire keeps its head. The palace without rival and the North Palace stand here among the temples of Ishtar and Nabu, and at this hour their courts are working. Officials with the day's tablets queuing at the offices of the treasurer and the chief eunuch, a delegation of vassal envoys. Judeans by their fringes, waiting, rehearsing their compliments, under wall reliefs, thoughtfully depicting the fate of Lachish, which is the point of the waiting room, in the temple of Nabu, god of writing, the scholars of the King's College checking the night's first stars against the Omen series, drafting the evening report. In the royal library rooms, lamplight on the shelves. Pigeonholes of cedar, tablets ranked and labelled. Where a copyist finishes his day's stint on Gilgamesh, tablet 11, the flood, and stamps the colophon of the king of the universe. Somewhere within, the king himself. This king, stylus at his belt, may be doing the thing no other monarch on earth can do, reading his own intelligence. And out beyond the palace parapet, the whole city turns toward evening at once, smoke of 100,000 suppers rising from the residential quarters, the park's Sennacherib planted breathing cedar and citrus into the cooling air, the water of the mountain canals, 95 kilometers of engineering, chuckling through the garden channels and down to the moat, the Tigris turning to hammered pewter beyond the western wall, and on the artificial terraced mountain beside the palace. If the theory holds, and tonight let it hold, the hanging garden itself, its high trees black against the last light, the water screws creaking somewhere inside like the city's own slow heartbeat. From the wall walk, the watchman can see the empire he stands on, the roads running out in every direction, punctuated by the lamps of the way stations, the villages of the resettled plain, the whole grim, brilliant, polyglot machine at rest. The first superpower at the absolute summit of the ancient world on an evening so secure that not one person in that city, from the scholar king to the Elamite labourer, could imagine that within 40 years all of it, walls, palaces, library, gardens, empire, would be gone. Hold the picture, complete and lit. We will need it, at the story's end, to measure the dark. But first, the city's quieter chambers deserve their hour, beginning with the ones the war reliefs never show, the rooms of the queens. Assyria's public art is a man's world so relentlessly that for a century archaeology assumed the queens were ornaments. The tablets and the tombs have since corrected the record and the correction guilds. Start with the institution, the queen, the woman of the palace, her formal title, ran an establishment of genuine power, her own estates across the provinces, her own administration and revenues, her own seal the scorpion on the evidence of the tombs, and the detail that startled historians, her own military units. Texts attest cohorts of the queen maintained from her household, alongside those of the crown prince and the queen mother. The palace's women commanded payrolls, and payrolls, in Assyria, were power's plainest measure. Then the persons, for the age of the Sargonids, is framed by two extraordinary ones. Samuramat, queen of Shamshi-Adad V, stood as something close to regent for her young son around 800 BC. She appears where no Assyrian queen had appeared, on a public stele in the sacred city among kings and gods, and on a monument recording that she crossed the Euphrates with the army on campaign. And from that astonishing silhouette, the Greeks, 5 centuries later, spun Semiramis. The legendary queen of Asia who conquered from Ethiopia to India, built Babylon and its gardens, and turned into a dove at her death. The ancient world's most famous woman, grown from a real Assyrian regent as a pearl grows from a grain of fact, Anukia. Sennacherib's West Semitic queen, Esarhaddon's formidable mother, who steered her son to the throne through the succession crisis, built him a palace at Nineveh in her own name. Her building inscription survives, written exactly like a king's, corresponded with the scholars, and upon Esarhaddon's death administered the loyalty oath binding the empire to her grandsons. Grandmother as guarantor of the world order. The treaty tablet exists, sworn to her. Legend gave Assyria a warrior queen. The files, more remarkably, give it a working one. And then, in 1988 and 1989, in one of the greatest archaeological finds of the 20th century, the queens themselves came back. Beneath the floor of the domestic wing of Ashurnasirpal's palace at Nimrud, under rooms Layard had walked over a century before, Iraqi archaeologist Muzahim Mahmud Hussein found the vaulted tombs of the imperial queens intact, sarcophagi holding the women of the 8th century. Among them, by their inscribed grave goods, Yaba queen of Tiglath-Pileser, Benitu queen of Shalmaneser, Atalia queen of Sargon, surrounded by the finest goldwork ever excavated in Mesopotamia, a crown of golden vine leaves, winged genies and flowers, delicate enough to tremble, a diadem of plaited gold ribbon, earrings, chains, anklets, bowls, mirrors, some 57 kilograms of gold in all, wrought with a jeweller's finesse the war reliefs never hinted their civilization contained, and with the treasure, texts, a tomb inscription in which Queen Yaba curses, in the palace's best legal style, any later woman who dares be buried in her tomb, in which, the excavators found, a later queen had been buried anyway, curse and all, palace politics pursued into the grave. The Nimrud gold survived the millennia only to face the modern age's dangers. Locked in the Baghdad bank vaults, it slept through wars, was feared lost, and was found again, flood-damaged but safe, in 2003. The queens of Assyria, 27 centuries on, still keeping their treasure through the falls of empires. Their find rewrote the picture for good, Beside the king's stone theatre of war there had existed, all along, a parallel court of women, propertied, lettered, politically armed, and buried like the powers they were. Semiramis, it turns out, was not a Greek exaggeration, but a Greek simplification. Return now to the engine we met at the beginning, the god whose estate was the world, and open the empire's soul a little wider, for Assyrian religion at its height was a vast double system. Above, the state theology of Ashur; below and everywhere, the most elaborate apparatus for reading the will of heaven that any civilization has ever operated. The state theology first, briefly, for we know its shape. Ashur enthroned as king of the gods, his temple at the old rock. Esarsagkura, house of the mountain of the lands, remaining the empire's ritual heart even after the capitals moved, the king as his high priest and steward, reporting campaigns to the god in formal letters, submitting each year to the rites that renewed the compact. The great gods around the throne like a cabinet. Ishtar of Nineveh and Ishtar of Arbela, the empire's fierce twin patronesses of love and war, whose oracles steadied kings in crisis. The archive preserves prophecies delivered to Esarhaddon in Ishtar's voice by ecstatic women and men of Arbela. Fear not. I am the great midwife who opened your path. The goddess speaking comfort to the anxious conqueror through the mouths of her prophets, in words a Judean contemporary would have recognized in form at once. Nabu of the stylus, patron of the scribes, rising with the empire's bureaucracy. Sin, the moon at Haran in the west. Remember Haran? The story ends there. Shamash the sun, lord of justice and of the diviner's verdict. Festivals kept the compact public. The New Year rites in which the king grasped the god's hand and the destinies were fixed. Processions when the divine statues travelled between cities like sovereigns on progress, provisioned by the way stations exactly as the couriers were. The roads served heaven and the post with the same mules. But the system's genius, and its deepest window into the Assyrian mind, was divination. The empire's conviction, elaborated into a science, that the gods wrote their intentions continuously into the fabric of the world, and that the whole world was therefore a text to be read. Everything signified, and everything was catalogued. The heavens above all, eclipse and halo, planet and star, the great celestial omen series running to 70 tablets, watched nightly by the crown's astronomers at stations across the empire, whose reports over 500 survive, flowed up the roads to the king like meteorology of the divine will. And in the process, as the watchers' records deepened across centuries, something enormous was quietly born. The observational archive from which Babylonian astronomy would learn to predict eclipses, the mathematical star science the Greeks would inherit, and the world after them. Modern astronomy's oldest route runs straight into the omen files of these anxious kings. Below the sky, the liver. The haruspex putting his question to Shamash and reading the god's yes or no in the entrails of a lamb. The practice standardized in handbooks with clay teaching models of the liver, zone by labeled zone. The empire's decisions of war and appointment routinely cross-checked against the verdict of the lamb. And around these, the dream books and birth omen series, the calendars of lucky and unlucky days, the exorcist's long rituals against the demons of disease, the substitute king waiting in the wings for the worst of the eclipses. It is easy to smile. It is wiser to see what the system was. A technology of decision under uncertainty. The first superpower refusing, on principle, to act blind, and building the best instruments its age could imagine for turning anxiety into procedure. The instruments look strange to us. The impulse runs the world's capitals tonight. And the archive, the impulse generated. The observations, the handbooks, the questions themselves, became, by the long irony this empire specializes in, one of its greatest gifts. The paperwork of superstition matured into the birth records of science. The gods of Ashur are gone. The habit of watching the sky and writing it down, which their servants perfected, has never lapsed for a single night since. One profession of the learned world deserves its own lamplit hour, because its files are among the most human in the whole archive, the healers. Assyrian medicine ran on a famous double track, and the empire saw no contradiction in it. Indeed, the two practitioners often attended the same bedside. The Asu was the physician of substances. His handbooks, well represented in the library, are organized head to foot. If a man's skull holds fever, if his eyes are clouded, if his stomach rejects bread. Each entry followed by prescriptions from a pharmacopoeia of several hundred plants, minerals, and preparations. Willow and licorice, cedar oil and honey, salves ground in beer, potions steeped overnight and drunk at dawn on an empty stomach, bandage recipes, even instructions the modern eye reads with a start. Wash your hands appears in the instructions, wounds are cleaned, bandaged, and redressed on schedule. The Ashipu was the physician of causes. In his understanding, serious illness was intrusion. A demon's grip, a ghost's hand, the anger of a god, the residue of a broken oath. And his therapy was ritual, diagnosis by symptom omen, then the incantations, the figurines that absorbed the affliction and were buried or burned, the purifications that peeled the invisible cause away from the suffering body. It is easy to sort the two into science and superstition. The bedside letters dissolve the sorting. There we meet the actual practitioners. Above all, Uradnanaya, chief physician to Esarhaddon, whose correspondence with his royal patient survives, the king describing symptoms and demanding answers, the doctor prescribing, adjusting, reassuring. This illness comes from the teeth. Let the teeth be drawn, and the fever will leave him. Advice as sound as any modern dentist's. Managing the royal anxiety as much as the royal body, coordinating with the exorcists when the case wanted both tracks, and once, magnificently, complaining that His Majesty will not follow the treatment plan. The princess's fevers, the crown prince's nosebleed bandaged, the letter grumbles, incorrectly by the attending staff, the courtier's insomnia. The file reads like any hospital's night notes, dressed in cuneiform. And the double track, seen from the patient's side, was simply thoroughness, the drug for the body, the right for the fear. The second medicine treating what the first could not reach, which every honest physician since has recognized as half the illness. The Greeks, centuries on, would inherit pieces of the pharmacopoeia down the long roads of transmission. The diagnostic handbooks would echo into later traditions, and the deepest survival is the pairing itself. Humanity has never really chosen between the Asu and the Ashipu, only renamed them. And on the nights when medicine runs out of medicine, every age reaches again in its own vocabulary for the second practitioner. Before the fall, the art. Because Assyria's palace reliefs are not decoration that happens to survive, they are one of the supreme achievements of world art and the empire's truest self-portrait made by its own hand. Grasp first what they were as a system. Kilometre upon kilometre of carved alabaster lining the state apartments of the palaces. Ashurnasirpals, Sargons, Sennacheribs, Ashurbanipals, each reign a new production, composed as continuous narrative, not icons but sequences, action unfolding scene by scene along the walls as a visitor walked, with settings, casts, episodes, captions cut into the stone like intertitles. Art historians reach for the modern word because no ancient word fits. This is cinema in stone, the first sustained narrative art of such scale and ambition in the history of the world, and its house style is documentary, where Egypt carved timeless emblems. Pharaoh eternally enormous, smiting eternal enemies. Assyria carved reportage, this campaign, that city named, this ramp, those particular reed marshes, the loot itemized, the terrain botanized. The Lachish room let the viewer follow the siege from the archer's first volley to the enthroned king receiving the surrender, with the vineyards of Judah rendered accurately enough for archaeologists to check. It is propaganda, of course. The king is serene, the machine never fails, the dead are always the enemies. But propaganda executed with an observational passion that keeps overflowing the brief. The mule's ear turned back, the exhaustion in a captive's shoulders, the water patterns of a river crossing, the individual grain of a date palm. The carvers, anonymous forever, were watchers of the world of the first rank, and their empire's cold documentary appetite gave them the license to look at everything. And when they looked at animals, the license became genius. For the summit of Assyrian art, by universal consent, is the great lion hunt cycle of Ashurbanipal's North Palace, and it is one of the summits of art, full stop. The occasion was ritual. The lion hunt was the king's oldest duty, the shepherd of his people destroying the wolf of the herds, order versus chaos staged in the flesh. By the 7th century, staged literally in an arena, lions released from cages before the royal chariot while soldiers held the ring. What the carvers made of it transcends every term of the commission. The king is perfect, poised, victorious, the brief fulfilled. But the lions are rendered with an intensity, an anatomical mastery, and a terrible sympathy that has stopped visitors' breath for 170 years. The charge with every muscle bunched, the arrow-struck male vomiting blood, still dragging himself toward the enemy. The lioness, spine severed by arrows, hauling her paralyzed hindquarters and roaring. The single most famous image in Mesopotamian art, called the Dying Lioness, in which agony and majesty are carved as one thing. A wounded male sinking with such weary dignity that the slab reads as tragedy. Whether the carvers intended pity, whether the king who commissioned his own triumph saw that the stones mourn his victims, is one of art history's great open questions. What is certain is what stands in the gallery. The empire of the iron machine in its last magnificent generation, producing images of suffering so profound they indict the very triumph they commemorate. The reliefs were painted once and blazed, buried, they kept their line, excavated, they crossed the sea. And in the British Museum tonight, under the lamps, the lioness is still dragging herself forward, the king is still drawing his bow, and the first superpower is still saying, more honestly in stone than it ever spoke in words, exactly what power is, and exactly what it costs, and exactly how beautiful and how pitiless one civilization could be in the same square meter of alabaster. Hold the lioness in mind. The empire that carved her had, when the chisels stopped, less than 20 years to live, and history was about to cast Assyria itself in her role. The fall of Assyria is the most stunning collapse in ancient history, and the fire must say plainly what makes it so. This was not a long decline, politely completing itself. The empire went from unchallengeable world supremacy to total extinction in roughly 20 years. A state that in 640 BC ruled everything, and by 609 BC did not exist. No rump, no successor dynasty, no Assyria in exile. Gone. Historians have argued the causes for a century and a half precisely because the speed defies the usual physics of empires, so let us assemble the elements as the evidence gives them, honestly, in their probable order. First, the silence at the center. Ashurbanipal's last decade is nearly undocumented. The annals stop, the building stops, the great correspondence thins. The scholar king dies around 631 BC in circumstances unrecorded, and the empire's own archive, our companion all night, goes dark exactly when we need it most. Itself a symptom. Something at the center had already stopped writing. Second, the succession sickness. The dynasty's oldest curse, now fatal. Ashurbanipal's death loosed a decade of instability. A son whose reign ended amid revolt. The general Sin-Shumu-Lisha, a eunuch, briefly claiming the throne itself, the only such usurpation in the empire's history. The deep hierarchy visibly cracking. Another son, Sin-Sharishkun, finally securing Nineveh but spending irreplaceable years and armies to do it. At the precise moment the machine needed a firm hand, it consumed itself selecting one. Third, and decisively, Babylon, one time too many, in 626 BC, amid the Assyrian civil strife, a Chaldean commander named Nabopolassar. By some accounts a former Assyrian officer, the machine's own training turned against it, seized Babylon and declared a new dynasty. And this rising, unlike every predecessor, could not be put down, because this time the empire's spare strength was fighting itself, year by grinding year. The Babylonian chronicles, terse and sober, let us watch. Nabopolassar cleared the south, took the ancient cities, threw back the counterattacks, and by 616 was raiding up the Euphrates into the Assyrian homeland itself. The century of southern hatred, banked since Sennacherib drowned the holy city and Ashurbanipal starved it, had found its instrument at last. And then the fourth element rode down from the eastern mountains and turned defeat into annihilation: the Medes. The Iranian highlands, which Assyria had raided for horses and lorded over for a century, and inadvertently schooled. Decades of Assyrian pressure had taught the Median tribes the price of disunity, had consolidated under a king the Greeks called Cyaxares into a formidable power with the one army in Asia that could meet Assyria's cavalry on better than equal terms. In 615-614, the Medes came over the Zagros, not to raid, but to end. In 614, they stormed the city of Ashur itself, the rock, the god's own home, the ancient heart untouched by war for 1,000 years, and sacked it with a thoroughness the excavators still read in the burn layers. And on the ruins, the chronicle records, Cyaxares, the Mede and Nabopolassar of Babylon met in person and swore alliance. Sealed, tradition adds, with a royal marriage whose grandchildren would build Babylon's next age. The coalition Assyria had spent 3 centuries ensuring could never form. The two-front nightmare, mountain cavalry and Mesopotamian siegecraft united by a common century of grievance, now stood assembled on the empire's home soil. Sin-Shar-Ishkun fought on with the machine's old skill. The chronicles record hard campaigning, relief marches, a last diplomacy that summoned, of all partners, Egypt to Assyria's side, the former province riding to the former master's rescue. The pharaohs had decided a wounded Assyria was better than a Median Babylonian world, realism's final complement. But the arithmetic had gone over to the enemy. In the spring of 612 BC, the allied armies, Medes, Babylonians, and, the chronicle notes, the Manda, the hordes, steppe peoples riding with them, converged up the Tigris and closed around the largest, richest, most magnificent city in the history of the world. Nineveh, which had never in its imperial existence heard an enemy trumpet, watched the coalition pitch camp against its 12 kilometers of walls, and somewhere in the palace without rival, beneath the reliefs of Lachish, the last king of Assyria prepared to learn what every small kingdom of 3 continents had learned beneath exactly those images. The siege of Nineveh had begun. The siege lasted, by the Babylonian chronicle's dry count, 3 months. 3 months for the city of the world. Tyre had held Assyria's own army 5 years. Babylon had cost Ashurbanipal 2, and Nineveh, vaster and richer than either, fell in a single summer, and the speed is itself part of the mystery. The chronicle gives the bones. From the month of Simanu to the month of Abu, the allies made 3 assaults upon the city. In the month of Abu, the city was taken, a great defeat inflicted upon the people and their king. Later tradition, Greek and biblical, adds the detail that has haunted the story ever since, that the river itself turned traitor. The Koza, which Sennacherib's engineering had trained through the city's heart, swollen by releases from the very dams and canals the great king had built, undermining a stretch of wall until the Watergate quarter collapsed and let the besiegers in. The prophet Nahum, exulting from Judah, sings that the gates of the rivers are opened and the palace dissolves. And the excavators note soberly that the tradition is at least consistent with the ground. Nineveh's weakest seams were always its waterworks. However, the wall was opened. What followed was the sack. And the fire keeps here the discipline it kept at Thebes and Susa and Babylon, Assyria's own works, no lingering. Say what must be said at distance. The city was killed. Burned from end to end, the excavation trenches find the ash layer everywhere, 1/2 meter thick in the palaces, its population slaughtered or scattered or marched away, its temples stripped, its palaces. The without rival, the North Palace, the library above its shelves, brought down in flame. At the Halsey Gate, the modern diggers found the last defenders where they fell, the arrowheads among them, a boy among the armed men, sealed under the collapsed gate they died holding. King Sin-Shar-Ishkun died in his burning city. Later legend, folding him into the Sardanapala story, gave him the pyre of his own palace. The chronicle says only that he perished. Every relief the visitor may see today in London or Paris carries somewhere on its surface the finale's signature, the gouges and burn shadows of that August. And, on certain slabs, something more precise. The faces of the king and his gods methodically chiselled out, the eyes attacked, while all around them the carving stands untouched. That is not plunder's haste. That is vengeance with a workman's patience. The deportees' grandchildren, perhaps, or the Medes whose highlands the machine had harrowed, taking time inside a burning palace to blind the images of power. Assyria had taught the world for 3 centuries exactly what the fall of a great city meant. In 612, the world returned the lesson to the teacher, with interest in the teacher's own grammar. What remained of the state ran west and lasted 3 years. A general or prince took the throne name Ashurbanipal. The second, the name of the king who had once written to Pharaoh as the empire's dawn announced itself, now worn by its dusk, and rallied the remnant at Haran, the moon god's ancient city on the western road, under Egyptian protection. The last Assyrian government, a court without a country. In 610, the allies came west and took Haran. In 609, the last counterattack. Egyptian and Assyrian together, the pharaoh Necho marching north in person and brushing aside, at Megiddo, the little army of Judah's king Josiah, who died trying to block the pass. The fall of Assyria collecting, to the very last, collateral from the small nations caught in its physics, failed before Haran's walls, and with that failure, the file simply ends. After 609 BC, there is no Assyrian state, no Assyrian king, no Assyrian army anywhere on earth. A political tradition 14 centuries old, the mightiest structure humanity had yet built, extinguished as completely as a lamp. The empire that had ruled from the Nile to the Caspian did not shrink or fragment or linger as a rump. Within the span of a single adult lifetime, a man born under Ashurbanipal's zenith was barely 50. It passed from omnipotence to non-existence. The ancient world drew breath and looked at the empty place where the colossus had stood. The prophet Nahum spoke the epitaph that half the world felt, "All who hear the news clap their hands, for upon whom has your wickedness not passed continually?" And the fire, holding the 2 ledgers to the last, adds the quieter half of the accounting. With Nineveh there burned also the library, the gardens, the workshops of the lioness carvers, the polyglot streets, the queen's gold under the floors. Everything the machine had built as well as everything it had broken. The flames were not selective. Why did it happen so fast? The question deserves its own hour, and the ancient world's own astonishment. And it is where the story turns from chronicle to autopsy. No collapse in antiquity has been argued over more, and the fire will lay out the findings the way the evidence ranks them. For the fall of Assyria has become, among historians, the great case study in how superpowers die. Not from one wound, but from a conjunction, each element survivable alone, fatal together. Begin with the structural verdicts. The empire was a core stretched over a world, the Assyrian heartland. The demographic and institutional engine was a small triangle of rain-fed farmland asked to garrison, administer, and periodically reconquer everything from the Nile to the Zagros. 3 centuries of annual wars had spent the Assyrian peasantry itself. The army, as we saw, was ever more the conquered fighting for the conqueror. Magnificent while the centre held, a standing question the moment it wavered, and when the crisis came, the core had no second army to lose. The system was king-shaped. Tiglath-Pileser's machine centralized everything into the royal person. Governors interchangeable, magnates broken, no institution capable of independent recovery, which made the state supremely responsive under a strong king and structurally helpless during a contested succession. The design guaranteed that the worst possible moment for a civil war was always now, and in 623 the design met its case. The empire manufactured its own enemies and educated them. A century of deportations, tribute, and punitive campaigns had pooled a reservoir of hatred across 3 continents. The Chronicle of 612's coalition is a roll call of the machine's own former subjects and victims. And, subtler, Assyrian pressure had forced its neighbours to consolidate in self-defence. The Median kingdom that broke the empire was, in a real sense, one of the empire's own unintended constructions, tribes unified by the annual experience of Assyria. The teacher of empire graduated its destroyers. And the hatred changed the physics of the end. Most fallen empires are absorbed, their machinery too useful to burn. Assyria alone was annihilated, its cities not occupied but executed, because for once the victors wanted no inheritance the ash could not carry. The intensity of the destruction is itself the measure of what 3 centuries of the two ledgers had banked. To the structural verdicts, the modern laboratory has added 2 findings. Climate, sediment, and cave stalagmite records from the region now document, with growing confidence, a swing towards severe multi-decade drought across exactly the empire's final decades. The 7th century's unusual wetness, which had helped float the imperial zenith and swell Nineveh's unsustainable size, giving way, after mid-century, to the driest interval in centuries. The rain-fed core's margin, always thin, shaved toward famine just as the civil wars began. Several historians now rank the megadrought among the fall's first causes. The empire's oldest patron, the northern rain, withdrawing its subsidy at the precise wrong moment. And overreaches arithmetic, the 7th century's spectacular additions. Egypt, Elam, proved fiscal wounds dressed as triumphs. Egypt unholdable and soon lost with nothing banked. Elam destroyed rather than harvested. A paying rival converted into an unpaying vacuum that filled with Persians. The brothers' civil war consuming the reserves of a state whose model required perpetual expansion to fund itself. The machine, built to run on conquest, had reached the ends of the profitable earth, and a system that cannot idle does not slow down, it stalls. Assemble it all. The exhausted core, the king-shaped fragility, the succession wars, the manufactured coalition, the drought, the empty treasury, and the mystery of the speed dissolves into something more sobering than mystery. The colossus was not murdered in its strength. It was a hollowing structure awaiting its push, magnificent to the last season, like a great tree dead at the root that falls entire in the first honest storm. The ancient world, which had trembled under Assyria for 3 centuries, understood the lesson at once and never forgot it. Every later empire of the region told Assyria's fall to itself as scripture, warning, or both, and the fire will let the oldest of those tellings, from a small kingdom that watched the whole story from beneath, stand as the autopsy's summary. I will make Nineveh a desolation, dry as the desert. This is the exultant city that dwelt securely, that said in her heart, I am, and there is none beside me. The grammar of superpowers conjugated for the first time to its final tense, and bequeathed, with everything else, to the heirs. For the strangest chapter of Assyria's story is the next one, how the annihilated empire conquered the future anyway. Here is the paradox on which the whole final movement of our story turns. No empire was ever destroyed so completely, and no empire's system ever survived so completely. The annihilation of 612 killed the Assyrian state. It could not kill the Assyrian idea, because the idea had already been learned by heart by everyone the state had governed, fought, or frightened. And the victors, before Nineveh's ash had cooled, discovered that they had inherited not just the territory, but the operating manual. Watch the succession run. Babylon first. Nabopolassar's son was Nebuchadnezzar II, the great king of the biblical age, builder of the Babylon of legend, taker of Jerusalem. And his brilliant half-century is looked at coldly, Assyria under new management. The provinces reorganized on the Assyrian grid, the army marching the Assyrian calendar of Western campaigns down the same roads to the same rebellious coast. The deportations continued by the book. The Judean exile of 586, the Bible's defining catastrophe, is Assyrian policy executed by Babylonian hands, procedure and all, the tribute economy, the vassal oaths, the annals' very phrasing carried over, even the capital's splendor. the walls, the processional way, the gathered gods? Is Nineveh's program restaged on the Euphrates? And if the Hanging Gardens were ever built at Babylon at all, they were an Assyrian invention twice over. Babylon's New Age lasted a single lifetime. In 539 it fell, with barely a battle, to the newest student. And the student was the great one, Persia. Cyrus and his successors. Heirs, remember, of the Persian house that had grown up in broken Elam, watching the machine at closest range, assembled the largest empire the world had yet seen, and built it, component by component, from the Assyrian kit. The satrapy system is the Assyrian province, renamed the Royal Road with its stations and remount relays, which Herodotus described to marvelling Greeks as Persia's wonder, neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness staying its couriers. Is Sennacherib's post road extended to Susa and Sardis, the king's eyes and ears? Persia's famed inspectors and informers institutionalized the Kepu and the intelligence files, the multilingual chancery, the deportee-built palaces, the tolerance and terror calculus towards subject peoples. Refined, softened at the edges, Cyrus's genius was to run the machine while advertising its mercies. The returning Judean exiles blessed him for reversing a policy Assyria had written, but the same machine and Persian kings said so themselves, adopting the old titulature, King of Kings, King of the Lands. And from Persia, the manual passed to the world. Alexander took the empire and kept its administration. His successors in Rome studied the model of the road, the province, the census, and the post. The caliphates inherited the same lands with the same grammar. And every state tonight that runs appointed governors over provinces, moves its mail by relay, keeps intelligence files, and calls itself the guarantor of order across many peoples is operating, at the end of a very long chain of custody, machinery first assembled on the Tigris. The victors of 612 burned the hardware and kept the software. Assyria's true tomb was never the mounds. It was every empire that came after, each one carrying the dead colossus forward inside its own skeleton, mostly without knowing its name. And alongside the institutional afterlife ran the other inheritance, stranger and deeper, the memory. For Assyria became the world's first great cautionary tale, the archetype through which 3,000 years have thought about imperial power itself, to the Bible's authors, whose nation had lived the whole arc, from Jehu's kneeling to the lost tribes to Jerusalem's deliverance to Nineveh's fall. Assyria became theology, the rod of God's anger, power as instrument and power as sin, the exultant city brought to desolation. Through scripture, Nineveh's name travelled into 3 world religions and every language they touched. The permanent shorthand for arrogant might awaiting its fall. And, in the book of Jonah, something subtler slipped through, the story of the prophet sent, against his will, to preach to Nineveh, and of the great city that repented in sackcloth from king to cattle, and was spared. The enemy capital of all cities on earth, chosen by the tradition as the stage for its greatest parable of mercy. Even the empire's bitterest rememberers, given the last word, used it to insist that Nineveh's 120,000 souls mattered to heaven. The Greeks, meanwhile, received Assyria as legend. Semiramis, the builder queen, Sardanapalus, the doomed voluptuary burning amid his treasures a slander on the scholar king, but an immortal one. Byron's play, Delacroix's vast crimson canvas, the romantic imagination's very image of oriental ruin descend from it, Nineveh as the first name in the genre of fallen greatness. When the Greeks and their heirs meditated on the mortality of empires, down to the traveller in the poem gazing on the shattered colossus, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," they were writing footnotes to 612. Rod of anger, spared city, burning king, desolate mound. The world kept Assyria as its permanent memento mori of power. The first superpower converted, by its enemies' pens, into every later superpower's bad dream. Only one thing was missing from the memory, for 25 centuries, Assyria's own voice. And the recovery of that voice, the mounds opening, the library speaking. We have already witnessed at this fire's beginning. What remains is to close the circle it opened, to stand where the story's survivors stand, in the present tense. Close the circle now, gently, in the present. begin with the strangest scene in the whole long afterlife, the one promised at the fire's start. In 401 BC, 2 centuries after the fall, the Greek mercenary army of the 10,000, retreating up the Tigris out of Persia's civil war, marched past 2 colossal ruined cities. Their chronicler, Xenophon, a careful and curious man, recorded the stupendous walls, asked the locals their history, and wrote down garbled names and a confused tale about Medes, because nobody living in the land of Assyria could tell him he was walking past Nimrud and Nineveh. 200 years, that is how long total forgetting took where the world's capital had stood. The mounds settled into their long sleep. The one over Nineveh's citadel carrying, in time, a shrine venerated as the tomb of the prophet Jonah himself. The story's most perfect irony compounding quietly for centuries, the prophet of Nineveh's sparing standing guard over the unrecognized corpse of Nineveh. And the sleep lasted, as we saw, until the shovels of the 1840s. And here the fire pays a debt promised long ago, when Sargon's lost capital first entered our story. For Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress city abandoned by Oman after 1 year's use, suffered in the modern age a second tragedy so painful that archaeologists still lower their voices over it. Khorsabad, being the first great site opened, yielded some of the earliest and finest treasures. Bottas and then Victor Place's French expeditions lifted from Sargon's palace a magnificent harvest. Colossal lamassu, relief cycles, bronzes, alabaster, the pick of the true king's art. And in 1855, the largest consignment ever assembled, well over 200 crates along with material from other sites, was loaded at Baghdad onto rafts and boats for the journey down the Tigris toward Basra, and the ships for France. At Kurna, near the river's meeting, the convoy was attacked by local raiders. In the chaos, the overloaded vessels capsized or were scuttled, and virtually the entire shipment. The finest single collection of Assyrian art ever gathered in one place went to the bottom of the river. Almost none of it has ever been recovered. Divers, dredgers, and hopeful expeditions across a century and a half have brought up next to nothing from the deep mud. Somewhere beneath the Tigris silt near Kurna, winged bulls of Sargon lie face down in the dark to this hour. The river that carried Assyria's boats of tin and its couriers' ferries, that drowned Babylon's walls at Sennacherib's order and opened Nineveh's at the end, taking one last, enormous toll from the empire's afterlife. The loss reshaped the field's very geography. It is partly why Paris, first into the ground, holds less than it found, and why the Louvre's surviving Khorsabad court, shipped in earlier, luckier consignments, is treasured doubly as the remnant of a remnant. And the lost capital's ill luck was not finished even then. In our own decade, the militants who wrecked Nimrud came to Khorsabad too, tunneling and looting the unexcavated palace mounds in their final months. Sargon's city was used for 1 year, forgotten for 25 centuries, drowned in part, plundered twice. And still, the surveyors report, the greater share of it has never been touched by any spade, patient under its village, keeping the true king's remaining secrets with the same stubbornness as every other mound in this story. If Assyrian history has a patron saint of archaeological melancholy, it is Dur-Sharrukin, the wonder nobody used, the treasure nobody received, and, perhaps some future season, the discovery nobody expects. But the modern chapter did not end in the triumphant museum galleries. It kept unfolding, and the fire owes the story its present-day pages told plainly. The site's modern history has been hard, war and neglect through the 20th century's convulsions. And in 2014, 2017, under the occupation of Mosul by the so-called Islamic State, a deliberate campaign of destruction unmatched since 612 itself, the shrine of Jonah blown up, revealing, in the bitterest archaeology imaginable, an Assyrian palace beneath it, which the militants then tunneled and looted. Bulldozers and explosives taken to Nimrod's palace and Lamassu. Nineveh's reconstructed gates wrecked. Museum sculptures sledgehammered on video for the world to see. Iconoclasm as propaganda. The ancient images murdered a second time by men who understood, exactly as the chiselers of 612 understood, that images of the past are power in the present. And then, the counter-chapter, still being written. The liberation? the international and, above all, Iraqi effort of documentation, reconstruction, and return. Archaeologists re-excavating the wreckage and finding, beneath the militants' rubble, reliefs the bulldozers missed, some in colours fresher than anything Layard saw. The Mosul Museum's shattered lamassu pieced together fragment by fragment, new digs at Nineveh proceeding under Iraqi direction, the mounds, patient beyond all their enemies, still holding. As ever, far more unexcavated than lost. Assyria's ruins have now survived the empire's fall, 25 centuries of oblivion, and the 21st century's worst. They are, at this hour, arguably better guarded and better studied than at any moment since the king's masons left. And one Assyrian city never needed rediscovering at all, because it never stopped. Arbela. Ishtar's oracle city, where the goddess's prophets steadied Esarhaddon and where Ashurbanipal celebrated his triumphs, is modern Erbil, capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, and its citadel mound, risen over 100 feet on the compacted layers of its own continuous life, is by many reckonings among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements on the face of the earth. 7,000 years and more of unbroken occupation, from prehistoric village through Assyrian holy city, through every subsequent empire to the families and tea houses on its summit within living memory. Under that mound, essentially unexcavated, one does not dig up a living town. The Temple of Ishtar of Arbela presumably still stands in some compressed stratum, the empire's beating oracle heart preserved beneath 26 centuries of ordinary breakfasts. Nineveh died and slept. Ashur died and slept. Arbela simply kept the lamps lit and the bread baking, and thereby outsurvived them all without a single dramatic scene. The quietest possible refutation of the whole idea of the fall of civilizations sitting in plain sight above the traffic of a modern city. When this night's travellers picture the empire's end, they may keep Erbil beside the ash of Nineveh. Not every Assyrian city has a burn layer, one of them just has residents, and the deepest survival is not stone at all. Scattered across the world tonight, in the villages of the Nineveh plain itself, in towns of southeastern Anatolia and northwestern Iran and Syria's Kabul Valley, and in a great modern diaspora from Chicago to Sydney, live several million people who call themselves, in unbroken self-description, Assyrians. The Christian communities of the old heartland. Chaldeans, Syriac Orthodox, Church of the East, whose ancestors were the farming population of Assyria that survived 612, the state died. The villages did not, who adopted Christianity in its very first centuries and carried through every subsequent empire the two oldest continuities the land possesses. The name, Sons of Ashur, they have called themselves through Persian, Greek, Arab, and Ottoman ages alike. And the tongue. Their liturgy and their kitchens speak dialects of Aramaic, the empire's own common speech, the language of the deportation caravans and the customs posts, the language Jesus spoke. Still alive, still sung on Sunday mornings, within sight of the mounds of Nineveh, the last spoken air of the world our whole night has travelled. Their modern history holds griefs this fire can only name with respect. Massacre and dispersal in the 20th century's wars, exile and church bombings in the 21st, the Nineveh plain villages emptied and partly refilled within the last decade, and holds, too, an unbroken stubbornness the old kings would have recognized as the national temperament surviving them. Communities that have now outlasted, by simple persistence, every single empire in tonight's story, including their own. When the Mosul Museum's restorers pieced the lamassu together, some of the hands doing the piecing belonged to people whose grandmothers sang lullabies in the language of Sennacherib's scribes. The first superpower is gone. The first superpower's people, against every odds in 26 centuries, are not. History offers few gentler ironies and none more earned, and it is the right final image to carry into the fire's summing up. Not the burning palace, but the mended bull and the living voice. The palaces have had the night. The fire owes an hour, before the summing up, to the Assyria that never appears on the reliefs. The villages, where 9 of every 10 Assyrians lived and died without once seeing a king, and whose steadiness was the true foundation under everything the annals boast. The documents let us in. Land sale contracts and harvest loans by the hundreds, census fragments, village dossiers in the provincial files, and the world they describe is instantly recognizable to anyone who has known dry farming country anywhere. A village of a few dozen mud brick houses on a low mound of its own ancestors' making. The wheat and barley lands stretching out in strips, ploughed with oxen in the autumn ahead of the rains. Everything in this world waits on the October rains, and the letters fret about them exactly as the omen reports do. Vineyards and olive terraces on the slopes where the hills begin, vegetable plots by the wells, and everywhere the sheep. The great flocks that were the North's true wealth, moving in their annual rhythm between village stubble and steppe pasture under shepherds who answered, like everyone, to the tax list. The year turned on the harvest and the threshing floor, on shearing and the wool tax, on the terrifying arithmetic of seed, corn and rain. The state was present as it is always present in such places. As the assessor measuring the standing crop, the recruiter working the muster rolls, the corvée summons for the canal or the royal road, the reservist's son who came home from the Western wars with silver or did not come home. The contracts show hard realities without gloss. Peasants sliding into debt at the standard ruinous interest after a bad year, selling land to the great estates, entire families entering dependency on magnate holdings. The empire's glittering redistribution ran, at the bottom, on margins as thin as anywhere in the ancient world. And the deportation system meant that many villages of the imperial heartland were themselves transplant communities. Aramaean, Israelite, Elamite farmers learning Assyrian reign. So that the countryside, like the army and the capital, was a mosaic wearing one administrative name. Yet the same files show the durable graces, village elders adjudicating under the local shrine, festival days when the plough rested, the beer jar contracts for wedding feasts, boys with slings guarding the ripening barley against birds, exactly as boys did in these fields this past spring. Hold this Assyria a moment against the other one, because history's judgment of the empire was written by its enemies and its kings, and both left out the majority. The people for whom Assyria was not terror or triumph, but weather, harvest, taxes, and home, who outlasted the fall, as we have seen, precisely because they're Assyria. The village on its mound, the rain-fed field, the flock on the steppe, was never the kind of thing a coalition could burn. The palaces were the empire's face. This was its body, and the body, quietly, is the part that survived. Before the tablet house and the courier's road set the table. For the archive feeds us Assyria's actual menu with an abundance no other ancient empire matches, from the peasant's loaf to the most famous banquet in antiquity. The base of everything, everywhere, was the grain. Barley bread and wheat bread from the courtyard ovens. The round tanner, direct ancestor of every clay bread oven from Morocco to India, its flat loaves slapped to the hot wall exactly as they are slapped in Mosul this morning. Porridges and groats, and barley's second, indispensable career, beer. The daily drink of the entire population, brewed thick and nourishing in every household, and issued as wages and rations. The texts count workmen's pay in bread and beer as naturally as we count coins, drunk through reed straws from communal jars in the old style, graded in the lists from workaday brews to fine filtered qualities for the table of the gods. Onions, garlic, and leeks seasoned everything. Lentils and chickpeas filled the pot. Sesame gave its oil. Dates came upriver from the brother country's palm groves by the boatload, the ancient world's sugar. The orchards Sennacherib boasted of gave apples, pears, figs, pomegranates, pistachios. Sheep and goats gave the feast day meat, the rivers gave fish, and the marshes fowl. And cheese, butter, and honey graded households by their frequency. Above it all, socially, floated wine. The northern hill's great advantage over Babylonia, whose vineyards appear in the tax rolls, and whose product ran a status ladder to the very top. The palace kept wine cellars whose administrative lists survive from Nimrod. Daily allocations to the queen's household, the scholars, the singers, foreign hostages, itemized by the jar. The world's oldest surviving wine registry, bureaucracy at the cellar door. And at the summit of the whole culinary pyramid, stands the document this night has already toasted once. Ashurnasirpal's banquet stele, which earns a second visit at table level because its menu is the grandest shopping list of the ancient world, beyond the herds and the 10,000 jars. Hundreds of deer and gazelles, ducks and geese and doves by the 10,000, fish and jerboa, eggs, breads, greens, pickled and spiced preparations, honeyed confections, nuts, cheeses, dates, and condiments down 100 itemized lines. 10 days, 69,574 guests, and, the stele insists, everyone sent home washed, anointed, honoured, and joyful. Cooks, needless to say, were professionals with their own hierarchy. The palace kitchens were departments of state, and though Assyria's own recipe tablets are lost, its Babylonian cousins survive the oldest recipes on earth. Broths rich with onion, family, and herbs, instructions finishing with the immortal serving note "it is ready," and the empire's tables certainly kept the tradition. Taste, at the end, the continuity. Because this is the part of the empire that never fell at all. The tanner bread, the sheep grilled with garlic and onion, the pomegranates and pistachios, the date sweets, the thick lentil pots of the Nineveh plain villages today are the imperial menu still in service, outlasting the kings by the same margin as the language. Cuisines, like grandmother's lullabies, do not read the chronicles. The armies ate to march. The villages, wiser, marched only to eat. And of the two logistics, it is the second that is still operational. One profession threaded every part of tonight together. The campaigns and the contracts, the omens and the library, the letters of kings and of farmwives all passed through the same trained hands. And the empire knew it. Of all Assyria's machines, none mattered more than the one that manufactured scribes. Follow a boy into the tablet house, the school attached to temple, palace, or a master scribe's own courtyard, at 6 or 7 years old, and watch the ancient world's most demanding education begin. The curriculum had not changed in essentials for 1,000 years, because the thing being learned had not. Cuneiform is not an alphabet, but a universe. 600 signs in practical use, most bearing several sound values and several word meanings, resolved only by context and convention. Mastering it meant years at the exercise tablets, the same sequence every Mesopotamian schoolboy had suffered since Babylon was young. Single wedges, then sign lists copied and recopied, the schoolboy tablets survive by the 1,000. Teacher's crisp line above, pupils' wobbling imitation below. 4,000-year-old homework, complete with erasures, then the great lexical lists. The sign dictionaries, the thematic vocabularies of trees, stones, professions, gods, then proverbs, model contracts, model letters, and at last literature. Extracts of Gilgamesh as a set text, hymns, the classics. And halfway up this ladder, the Assyrian pupil hit the wall his Babylonian predecessors never faced so starkly: Sumerian. The dead language of the deep tradition, extinct in the streets for over a millennium, yet mandatory for the learned, learned from bilingual lists as our scholars learn Latin. The schoolboy of Nineveh was, by graduation, a philologist of 2 languages in one impossible script, plus, increasingly and unofficially, literate in a 3rd. The Aramaic alphabet running through the streets and offices, 22 easy letters inked on leather, which every practical scribe now read as well. The reliefs show the pairs at work after every battle. 2 scribes side by side counting the spoils, one pressing cuneiform into clay, one penning Aramaic on a scroll. The 1,000-year script and its nimble successor employed by the same quartermaster. One of history's great transitions caught in a single carved image. Graduates fanned out into every artery the night has travelled. Junior clerks on the harvest censuses, letter writers in the market, provincial chancery men drafting the governor's dispatches, army scribes with the baggage train, the elite ascending toward the temple colleges and the omen disciplines, apprenticed for further years to the astronomer or the haruspex, and the summit, the king's own scholars, the men whose letters we have read all night, personal tutors of princes. It was exactly this ladder, remember, that produced the anomaly on the throne. Ashurbanipal was tablet housemaid. The profession had its pride and knew its power. Scribes signed fine tablets, cited their teachers, cursed careless copyists in colophons. A proverb they copied for centuries says it without blushing. The scribal art is the mother of orators and the father of scholars. And it had, in the end, the last laugh of the entire civilization. Every king in this story is dust and epithet. The anonymous men of the tablet house are the reason we know any of it at all. The empire's swords rusted in a generation. Its homework survived 26 centuries. There is a lesson there that every schoolboy who ever wobbled a line under a teacher's fair copy is entitled to enjoy. One more journey before the gathering. The shortest of the night and the fastest. Not a merchant's year or a king's campaign, but a single dispatch, ridden down the royal road through one autumn night, because nothing else the fire can show carries the living empire so completely in so small a frame. Begin at dusk on the western frontier. A fortress commandant above the Euphrates has intelligence that cannot wait. Movements beyond the river, a vassal's messenger intercepted, the report dictated in terse chancery Akkadian, pressed, sealed, wrapped, sealed again, the way-pass validated, and the first rider goes out through the gate at a canter with the 2-tablet packet in his satchel as the lamps of the fortress drop behind. Feel the system carry him. The road runs ahead through the dark, graded and known. His horse's 10th time on this stage. At the river, the ferrymen are on duty because the road's law keeps them on duty. And 2 hours on, the first station shows its lamp. Walls, a well, a stable smelling of fodder and warm animals, a keeper who has heard the hooves and is already leading out the remount. The exchange is a minute's work. Seals shown, the log tablet noted station, hour, rider, the empire files, even its own speed. Bread and a mouthful of beer standing, and the road again. A new horse's rhythm. The stars wheeling gradually over the steppe, jackals answering each other away in the dark, the mileposts of empire going by. A village mound asleep on its own centuries, a canal breathing cold air, the gallows silhouette of an old campaign at a crossroads keeping its grim advisory, the walled dark of a provincial town where the gate watch calls a challenge and waves the satchel. Through king's business, no toll for the king's own words. Rider follows rider through the relay night. The packet passing hands at each stage like a live coal, each man carrying it 1 horse's worth of the world. Through the hill country as the late moon rises, down at dawn into the home plain where the road widens and the traffic thickens around it. Farm carts to market, a tribute caravan breaking camp, infantry of the standing army swinging out of a depot town in steppe. And ahead, at last, out of the river haze, the thing itself. The walls of Nineveh, taking the sunrise along 12 kilometers of rampart, the gate towers gilded, the lamassu at the Nergal gate meeting the last rider with the same stone smile that met our own arrival at the beginning of the night. Through the gate, up the processional avenue against the morning crowds, to the palace offices. And the packet seals are broken in the chancery of the palace without rival, while the frontier it left at dusk is still eating breakfast. 700 kilometers in under a week when the system ran well. The words of the edge, in the ear of the center, at a speed the world would not match again for many centuries after the fall. Somewhere in the files, a clerk logs the arrival. Somewhere on the western road, the riders are already carrying other packets the other way. It is only a message. It is the whole empire in one night. The roads, the stations, the seals, the watchfulness, the reach. Power, in the end, is exactly this. The distance across which your word still moves while the world sleeps. Assyria measured that distance for 3 centuries, farther than anyone had ever measured it. And now, with the dispatch delivered, the fire can gather the whole story home. Draw the night together now, as the embers settle. The deep themes this oldest of empires has been teaching beneath its trumpets and its ash. The first. Systems outlive intentions. Assyria's kings sought glory, plunder, and the god's estate. What they actually built. The province, the road, the post, the census, the standing army, the intelligence file, detached itself from every purpose they held and became the permanent equipment of human government, running on tonight in states that have never heard of Ashur. Build a tool and you set it loose in time. It will serve masters you cannot imagine, for ends you did not choose. The empire is dust, The manual is still in print. The second, terror is alone, and the interest compounds. For 3 centuries the calculus worked. Fear garrisoned what armies could not, and the ledger never showed the accumulating balance. The hatred banked in every deported village and burned city, waiting for the first weak season to be called in. When it was called, in 612, the repayment was so total that nothing of the creditor remained. Every power since that has mistaken fear for loyalty, has been rerunning Assyria's books, and the books always balance the same way in the end. The third, the strong center is the fragile center. Tiglath-Pileser's design. Everything through the king, no rival institutions, no independent strength anywhere, made Assyria the most responsive state of its age and the most brittle, supremely effective in strong hands, helpless the moment the hands were disputed. It is the permanent trade-off of concentrated power, stated for the first time at imperial scale. What makes a system unstoppable in fair weather is exactly what makes it unrecoverable in foul. The fourth, empires educate their destroyers. The Medes were consolidated by Assyrian pressure. The Persians grew up in the vacuum Assyrian totality created. Babylon's avenger may have trained in Assyrian service, and every one of them conquered with Assyrian methods. Domination is a school in which the syllabus is yourself. Teach the world your machine for long enough, and the world will graduate. The fifth, what survives is never what was defended. The walls, the army, the terror, everything built to last fell in a season. What crossed the centuries was the undefended remainder, the library saved by its own destruction, the homework of schoolboys, the observations of anxious astrologers maturing into astronomy. A common language spread by deportation caravans, still sung in village churches. The farmers on their mounds, out-enduring every king. Assyria is history's sternest statement of the rule this fire keeps finding everywhere. Permanence goes not to what power protects, but to what quietly seeds itself in ordinary hands. And the sixth, the quietest, carved by the empire's own artists. The lioness outlasts the hunter. Of everything Assyria made, the work the world now travels to stand before is the image of its victim. The dying lioness, agony and majesty in one stone, pity smuggled into the very monument of triumph. Whatever the carvers intended, time has made the choice for them. The king's serenity reads as period style. The lioness reads as truth. Art, given centuries, sides with the suffering. And the first superpower's most eternal achievement turned out to be its own indictment, carved in-house by hands it never thought to fear. So let the whole of it pass once more, gathered and slow, the way the Tigris passes the old mounds. The entire story, once through, from the rock to the ash and out the other side. It begins with a crag above the river and a god who was the crag. Ashur, city, god, and people sharing one name. A modest town of merchants whose donkey caravans plodded 6 weeks into Anatolia, whose families wrote home about tin prices, taxes, and neglected wives, and whose first empire was a web of contracts 1,000 kilometers wide without a soldier on it. It learns the other trade in the hardest school. Shamshi-Adad's one-generation dream, 4 centuries as prize and vassal among giants, the muscle age of the great kings. Tukulti-Ninurta taking holy Babylon and dying for it under his son's conspiracy, and then the world's ending, around 1200, which Assyria alone of the great powers survives. Battered, narrowed, undefeated, to stand in the wreckage of the Bronze Age, holding the one intact machine on earth. The reconquest gathers the old lands like an audit. Ashurnasirpal builds Nimrud and feasts 70,000 guests beside annals of calculated horror. The 2 ledgers open side by side forever after. Shalmaneser grinds the west until Jehu of Israel kneels in black stone. The machine stalls in a generation of drift. Then Tiglath-Pileser rebuilds it into the first true imperial system. Provinces and governors, the standing army, the deportation gears, the roads and the flying post. Sargon takes the true king's name, breaks Urartu, builds a capital, and dies unburied. The omen that bends his son's whole soul. Sennacherib makes Nineveh the wonder of the world. Walls, gardens, the aqueduct at Jerwan, perhaps the hanging gardens themselves. Cages Hezekiah in Jerusalem without taking it, drowns holy Babylon in fury, and dies under his own son's knives among the gods. Esarhaddon, trembling and formidable, rebuilds what his father destroyed, crosses Sinai to conquer Egypt, hides from eclipses behind substitute kings, and binds the future with a treaty of curses that echoes in scripture yet. Ashurbanipal, stylus beside sword, sacks Thebes, erases Elam, wins the war against his own brothers burning Babylon, and gathers 30,000 tablets into the library that will be his only surviving kingdom. We toured the machine at its height, the army that out-systematized the world, the roads where the king's word crossed 700 kilometers in a week, the files, the eyes, the uprooted millions whose sorrow blended the Near East into one polyglot world speaking Aramaic, the evening streets of Nineveh where all of it converged, the queens with their cohorts and their buried gold, the scholars reading heaven nightly and accidentally founding astronomy, the carvers giving the dying lioness her immortal wound. And then, in 20 years, the whole of it. The scholar king dies into silence. The succession devours the reserve. Babylon rises unquenchable under Nabopolassar. The Medes come over the mountains. Drought shaves the rain-fed core. And in 612, the coalition of everyone the machine ever taught or hurt closes on Nineveh and kills it in a summer. The library baking to permanence in the flames. The faces chiseled blind. The last king dying in his rival-less palace. Haran falls 3 years later, and the file of the Assyrian state simply ends. The victors keep the software. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, then Persia's royal road and satrapies, then every empire after, run the dead colossus' system under new flags. The Bible and the Greeks keep the name as the world's first parable of fallen power. Xenophon marches past the unrecognized walls. The mounds sleep under the tomb of Jonah until the shovels of the 1840s raise the winged bulls. The ropes and rafts float them to the museums. Rawlinson dangles at Behiston. The sealed translations match. George Smith reads the flood and forgets his coat. And Assyria speaks again in its own voice, 30,000 tablets strong. The mounds survive even the 21st century's iconoclasts. The restorers piece the Lamassu back together. And in the villages of the Nineveh plain and a worldwide diaspora, the sons and daughters of Ashur. Christian these 17 centuries, Aramaic on their tongues. Outlast, by simple stubborn continuity, every single power in the story, including their own. That is the whole arc. Contract to conquest, rock to superpower, superpower to ash, ash to archive, archive to voice. The first empire of the world, ending as the world's first warning and surviving, after all the endings, as a library and a language and a people. The grass grew over Nineveh. Under the grass, the tablets kept every word. And of all the endings this fire has told, none argues more patiently that nothing written with care is ever truly lost. It only waits, baked hard by its own catastrophes, for someone to come back down the road with a lamp and a brush and the wish to listen. And now the story is told, and there is nothing left to conquer and nothing left to fear. The armies are dust and the archives are safe. The two ledgers are closed and balanced, and the night lies over the old land of Ashur as it lay before any of it began. The river running dark and patient between its reeds, the plains breathing out the day's warmth, the great mounds resting under the stars like sleepers who have finally been allowed to sleep. Let them rest now. Let the kings rest, and the scribes, and the uprooted, and the lioness. And let yourself rest with them. Feel how quiet it has become. The trumpets have been silent for 26 centuries. The couriers' hoofbeats have faded down all the roads. Even the great city's 100,000 voices have settled into the deep hush that the river has kept ever since. You may let your eyes rest now. Close them if they wish to close. There is no dispatch tonight, no omen to read, no watch to stand. The watchmen of Nineveh called the hours for 300 years, and the hours passed anyway. Tonight the hours will pass on their own, and nothing is required of you at all. Let your body grow heavy, the way the winged bulls are heavy. Settled, monumental, past all urgency. Guardians who long ago discovered that the truest way to hold a gate is simply to remain. Let your shoulders drop, the day's armour set down at the door. Let your hands soften and open. No stylus, no seal, no rein, nothing to carry, nothing owed. And let your breath find the oldest rhythm this old land knows, in, like the autumn rain arriving over the northern fields, slow, generous, answering every anxious letter at once, out like the river leaving for the sea, unhurried, certain, carrying everything that is finished, in and out. The Tigris breathes this way, the sleeping mounds breathe this way, 1 century at a time, and you may breathe with them for as long as you like. The images of the night can pass now, like the last lamps along the walls. You do not need to hold a single one. The donkey caravan fading into the hills with its letters and its socks. The banquet lamps of Nimrod, 70,000 guests going home in peace. The queen's golden crown of vine leaves trembling in the tomb light. The farmer's coat on the shoulders of the king of the universe, waiting out the eclipse. The stylus in the king's belt. The lioness, magnificent and mortal, given forever by the hands that felled her. The tablets raining into the fire that would save them. The courier's lamp-lit way station, the fresh horse already led out into the dark. The citadel of Arbela, 7,000 years of breakfasts deep, its evening windows lighting one by one above the modern traffic. The mended bull rising under the restorer's hands. Let each one come and gleam and pass. The night watchman of your mind logging them through the gate, king's business, no toll, until the road behind them is empty and quiet and yours. And if sleep is rising in you now, let it rise. It comes tonight like the thing this empire never once managed and always longed for, there at the bottom of all the omen reports and the substitute kings and the walls 100 feet high, safety. The perfect safety of the sleeper, which no army ever conquered and no fall ever touches. The one citadel that needs no garrison, whose gates stand open precisely because nothing can enter that matters. The kings of Assyria watched the sky all night for warnings. You may close your eyes on the same sky in peace. It kept its appointments then. It will keep them now. The stars are over the Tigris this very hour, moving in the courses the old astronomers logged so faithfully that we still keep their nights on file. The same slow constellations that rose over the tablet house and the way stations, over the queen's gardens and the shepherd's fires, unhurried then, unhurried now. The river is running? The mounds are holding everything safely till morning, as they have held it through every morning for 2,500 years. So rest now, traveller. The first superpower rose and ruled and fell, and the world went on, and the wheat still comes up green in the spring rain around the villages of the Nineveh plain. Whatever empires rise and fall in your own days, this is what remains at the bottom of the ledger. Every time. The river, the rain, the grain, the story, and the rest that follows every story, which is yours now. If, some other evening, you wish to walk through other ages and other gates, the fire will be lit and new journeys with it. And if tonight's journey brought you rest, you might, tomorrow, in the daylight, leave a word below to say where in the world you slept. But that is for tomorrow. Tonight there is only the dark plain, and the old slow river running seaward in the dark, and the patient stars keeping the empire's last, gentlest, longest watch. The east will take care of the dawn. It has never once missed in all the mornings since Nineveh. You have nothing to do but breathe and settle and let the night hold you, safe as a tablet in the deep earth, keeping its words for the morning. Sleep well, traveller. Good night.